Chapter 1279. The hat on Feng Ling's head had been taken off by herself. Her black hair, which had never been dyed, was scattered softly on her shoulders, and there were still some bangs on her forehead. She was wearing the high heels used in the fitting room to change clothes, and her sportswear had turned into a pearl-colored dress. Seeing Feng Ling come out, Xiaoba stood there for a long time before suddenly shouting, Cog! Come and see, come and see. A fairy has descended to the world, Feng Ling was already feeling uncomfortable. Hearing Xiaoba's shout, her face instantly turned thin. She turned around and rushed back to the fitting room to change her clothes. At this time, Jinwan happened to come over. Hey, why are you hiding? With that, she rushed over. You're really beautiful. Stand properly. Let me see if you need any other accessories. Feng Ling was suddenly pulled by Jinwan and had to turn around. She was beautiful, but it was too exaggerated to say that a fairy had descended to the world. Xiaoba's character was very lively, especially when she knew that Feng Ling was embarrassed, so she deliberately wanted to praise her, but she accidentally couldn't hold back and said a little exaggeratedly. Fortunately, Jinwan appeared in time. Feng Ling was tall. Although she was thin, her figure was perfect. Wearing such a dress and high heels, she didn't need to dress up at all. She looked very fresh and eye-catching. It was not an exaggeration to say that she was beautiful. The size of this one is also very suitable. Jinwan looked at the size of the dress she was wearing and said, in the future buy clothes in this size. It's just right to wear. Don't always wear those loose sportswear and t-shirts. Buy a few more here today and bring them back. In the future, remember to wear them when you come to work in MN. Don't wear those sportswear anymore. Feng Ling, wear it at work? Jinwan raised her eyebrows and gently stroked the material of the dress on her shoulders. Yes, I'm the boss. After all, you're studying and working in our MN group. I created a learning and working environment for you. You should listen to me, shouldn't you? Feng Ling, I really didn't ask anything of you, Jinwan said seriously. Jinwan said seriously, it's about time to mention that the clothes I bought for you today, you have to wear them for at least 3 days a week, and then you can wear them as you see fit for the other 4 days. In short, he had to change Feng Ling's dressing habit step by step, but he couldn't rush it. Wearing a skirt 3 days a week was not too much. After that, Jinwan continued to take Feng Ling and Xiaoba shopping in the mall. After spending 4 to 5 hours, she helped Feng Ling choose many sets of clothes. There were some single-piece tops and some well-designed pants. There were also some beautiful suits, some dresses, and some beautiful dresses that were separated and matched together. In short, he bought almost all the fashionable and OL-style clothes and asked Feng Ling to bring them back to wear. Jinwan also chose 2 sets of clothes for Xiaoba. Xiaoba was overjoyed. At night, even though she had been out for a day, Feng Ling still came to Jinwan at her regular fitness time and taught her the simple martial arts and movements for self-defense. During the day, Jinwan's fighting ability in the mall could not be underestimated, but after returning home, she became useless. Originally, she wanted to lie on the bed and laze around, but she was still cruelly pulled up from the bed by Feng Ling and forced to exercise in the fitness room. Feng Ling, you haven't returned to the base for training for so long. Why is your stamina still so good? Aren't you tired after walking out for a day? Jinwan asked helplessly as she walked on the treadmill. I wore flat shoes during the day, not high heels. I'm not tired. I'm also wearing flat shoes. Jinwan let out a long breath and tried to cheer herself up to continue walking quickly. Feng Ling was thinking about Jinwan's health. After Jinwan had a miscarriage in Los Angeles, she was depressed for a long time and didn't sit well during the month of confinement. Her physical condition deteriorated every day. If she took the time to exercise well now, her physical condition would be much better. In the 2 years since Jinwan arrived in England, other than when she was too busy, her life had been very regular and rational. She and Feng Ling had the same tacit understanding. That was, Jinwan did not mention a word about Mo Jingshan, and Feng Ling did not say a word about Li Nanheng. Walk for another 20 minutes and then do the movements I taught you last night. Review them and learn the new movements next time. Although Feng Ling was teaching Jinwan by the side, she still accompanied her to practice. She turned on another treadmill by the side and maintained the same rhythm as Jinwan. 2 hours later, Jinwan was so tired that she sat on the sofa to drink water. After drinking a large glass of water, she leaned against the sofa weakly and looked at Feng Ling, who did not sit down but put on a baseball cap and coat to go home. By the way, there's something I almost forgot to tell you. What is it? Feng Ling was indeed preparing to go home. Hearing this, she turned back to look at her. Do you remember Mr. Zan's younger brother who is the vice president of the London International Bank? That time when we went to UNL with Mr. Zand, we coincidentally met the young, fair and gentle-looking one. Feng Ling recalled briefly, I don't remember. Jin Wan? That's right. Feng Ling was the type who did not like to take strangers to heart. After seeing him for a few days she probably forgot about him and did not take it seriously. Diske, then I'm afraid his love is unrequited. I met him again 2 days ago, but I met him at a financing meeting in London. After all, he's the vice president of the London International Bank. He's very knowledgeable in financial investment. Many companies here find it difficult to speak to him, let alone ask for financing. But perhaps because we're Mr. Zan's subordinates he's quite polite to us. More importantly, we've only met once before. I remember that he was especially cold to us and didn't even bother to ask for our names. But he remembers and specially asked why you didn't go with me. Jin Wan smiled and leaned against the sofa. I met him again 2 days ago, but at a financing meeting in London. Feng Ling looked at Jin Wan. So, based on a woman's sixth sense, I feel that he seems to be interested in you. Feng Ling did not have much expression. If there's nothing else, I'll go back first. Why are you leaving? I don't think he has any feelings for Li Nanheng right now. He doesn't even plan to return to 11 base. Could it be that he plans to be alone for the rest of his life? I think Mr. Zan's brother has a good character and looks. Most importantly, he is gentle and gentlemanly. If there is a chance to develop well. Chapter 1280. Think about yourself first. Feng Ling did not wait for Jin Wan to finish speaking. She interrupted her and turned to leave. Jin Wan? Feng Ling had just walked out of the door when Xiaoba came back. The moment she saw Feng Ling she knew that she must have tortured Jin Wan in the gym. Xiaoba was especially afraid that one day, Feng Ling would drag her into Jin Wan's gym to train. She immediately grinned at her with a fearful expression. Ehe, goddess, you're going home already? Aren't you staying for a meal? Xiaoba was Jin Wan's fan, and Jin Wan was also Xiaoba's life goal. However, Feng Ling had always been Xiaoba's goddess. She was the kind of goddess who was unreachable. Feng Ling glanced at her indifferently. It's fine if you stay for a meal. It's fine if you stay to teach me a set of boxing moves. Xiaoba. She immediately made an inviting gesture. Please go home. Feng Ling snorted, but a smile appeared in her eyes. She liked the way she interacted with Jin Wan and Xiaoba. It was very relaxing. She could be herself casually and did not need to be too restrained. After leaving Jin Wan's residence, Feng Ling did not go home directly. She had just received a call from Mr. Zan asking her to go over to get some documents. Mr. Zan's private villa. As soon as Feng Ling arrived, she saw a limited edition blue Bugatti parked in the villa. She didn't remember Mr. Zan having this car in his garage. Could it be a new car? However, this car was completely different from Mr. Zan's usual steady and shrewd personality. It seemed to be driven by a younger person. Feng Ling only took a glance and walked in. When she entered, she saw 2 cups of coffee on the coffee table in the villa. She usually didn't drink coffee, so the coffee was clearly not for her. It seemed like there were other guests here. Miss Feng, you're here. Fei Yong walked over and said, Mr. Zand and Mr. Ian are chatting in the study. They'll be out soon. Please wait a moment. Feng Ling nodded. Ian was the vice president of the London International Bank that Jin Wan mentioned. He was of British and Chinese descent. He seemed to be around 32 or 33 years old. She didn't know much about him. She had only heard Mr. Zan mention this younger brother. He wasn't his biological brother but seemed to be the younger brother of a cousin. After all, Mr. Zan was of pure British descent, but Ian was half Chinese. Therefore, Mr. Ian spoke Chinese more fluently than Mr. Vincent, and it was more convenient for them to communicate. Feng Ling really didn't have much interaction with Mr. Zan's younger brother. She had only met him once or twice because of the relationship between Jin Wan and Mr. Zan. When they were talking together, she would sit by the side and listen while learning. Right now, she was in a state of observing and learning. She still had to follow Jin Wan, but fortunately Jin Wan was around. She told her everything about business without hiding anything. She would also patiently explain all the ways to communicate with businessmen to her in detail. Thus, Feng Ling had indeed improved greatly. She could already negotiate contracts and meet clients alone, and she could successfully earn a lot of money based on her own judgment. The Filipino maid went to pour Feng Ling a glass of apple juice. After thanking her, Feng Ling stood in front of the window in the living room. She held the apple juice while looking at the garden scenery in the front yard of the villa. Mr. Zan's front yard and backyard were decorated very well. Most of them were green plants and the air was good and fresh. After waiting for less than 10 minutes, Feng Ling heard someone laughing and chatting behind her. Then she heard footsteps coming down the stairs. She turned back and saw Mr. Zand and Mr. Ian walking down with a smile. "You're here?" When Mr. Zand saw Feng Ling, he waved at her. "Come here. I've printed out the documents I mentioned last time. Take them back and tidy them up. Take a good look." Feng Ling walked over and took a stack of documents. They were all English words and numbers. She could understand them. After all, she had grown up in the United States. She nodded. "All right, apart from these typical business cases, do you need me to look at any other financial cases? Read these first. Write a summary for me later." Feng Ling's expression instantly stiffened. Her face was filled with disbelief. "You want to write a summary? Why else do you think I asked you to read these?" Mr. Zand smiled. "Grandpa gave it to me to teach you how to be a smart businessman. You have no foundation to begin with. From one industry to this industry, what you should absorb is not from books, but all the experiences you have learned. In the past half a year in England, you've seen and heard a lot. Now it's time to work hard on these cases. I asked you to write a summary to see how much you've absorbed. There's no need to write too detailed. Just write what you want to express." Feng Ling. "All right, I understand." She placed the documents into the bag she had brought with her and carefully put them away. Ian stood by the side and did not speak, but he did not leave. He only looked at Feng Ling for a while. Mr. Zand usually did not speak much, nor was he someone who dawdled. After giving his instructions, he asked Feng Ling to go back. However, as he spoke, he felt that his brother's eyes seemed to be staring at her, so he turned to glance at him. "What's wrong? Are you interested in my student?" A scrutinizing smile appeared on Ian's handsome face. "I'm just very curious about this Miss Feng. She's clearly a very beautiful lady, but why does she always have a straight face all day? Furthermore, she doesn't seem to have a good temper. The first 2 times I met her, it wasn't very pleasant, but I have a deep impression of her." Feng Ling replied calmly, "I'm sorry. I've always been like this since I was young. I don't mean to offend anyone. If I accidentally offend Mr. Ian, please don't hold it against me on account that Mr. Zand is my mentor." "Ah." Ian laughed. No, Miss Feng, you don't have to be so polite. You didn't offend me." Mr. Zand raised his brows and gave Ian a meaningful look. Ian also gave him a look, indicating that he was indeed interested in his student. Mr. Zand sneered without giving him any face. "This female student of mine is not so easy to conquer. Be careful." The conversation between the two men was too direct. It was not like Feng Ling did not understand. She did not speak or participate in this topic. She only took the documents with a calm and indifferent expression and left. "I'll go back first. I'll get someone to send you," Mr. Zand said. After saying that, he glanced at Ian. Of course, the person he wanted to call was his younger brother. He had to have some awareness of being a grown man. "No need. I drove here myself." Feng Ling did not look back. Chapter 1281. Feng Ling walked out of the villa. The person behind her did not chase after her. She could be considered happy and quiet. After entering the car, she placed the documents in her hands on the passenger seat and drove back. She drove home, showered, and dried her hair before reading the documents. The night passed just like that. The next day, she continued to work at Jean Wan's company. Mr. Zand rarely came to Jean Wan's place. Even though he was old, he was completely a respectable elder. However, he seemed to be very concerned about being too close to Jean Wan. Although Mr. Mo and Jean Wan had not contacted each other for more than 2 years, Feng Ling often felt that Mr. Zand had been maintaining a certain distance from Jean Wan due to the pressure from Mo Jingshan, afraid that there would be any misunderstandings. Of course, this could only be a guess. After all, they had already divorced and no longer contacted each other. It was Mr. Mo who had brought up the divorce. How could he possibly give others pressure? Jean Wan's personality was very tough. Although she did not say it out loud, she would usually be as happy as she was with everyone. When she was alone at night, she would not feel sad or anything. However, Feng Ling knew that Jean Wan's personality had subtly changed a lot. Both of them had changed a lot. Jean Wan was forcefully pushed out from a warm embrace, while Feng Ling, it was hard to explain. The two of them felt more like bosom friends in a foreign country, so their relationship became better and better. It was the weekend and it was a holiday. It was rare for Jean Wan and Xiao Ba to rest at home. As they were afraid that Feng Ling would drag them out of bed to go to the gym, they decided to mercilessly reject Feng Ling outside the door. Feng Ling decided to read and learn alone at home. After staying at home for the entire morning, She recalled that Mr. Zan had introduced a book to her. Last week when she went to buy it, she did not manage to buy it. He said that it would arrive in a week. She changed her clothes and headed out. The bookstore she was going to was about a 15-minute drive from her residence. After arriving, she directly entered the bookstore to find the book. This bookstore was on the first floor of a department store. It was connected from the inside to the outside, and people often used it as a side door to enter, so there were all kinds of people coming in and out. Today was the weekend, so there were a lot of people coming in and out. Feng Ling was walking past the business and finance books area. She picked up a book and flipped through it. After reading for a while, she turned to continue looking. Suddenly, she found a book that she had never seen before, but the content inside was very interesting. It was also related to finance and business, but the author's expression was very humorous. As she read, she was quickly attracted. She would not feel sleepy, nor would she feel like she was learning. Instead, it was as if she had learned a lot of various cases from a short story. Feng Ling was fascinated by it. She stood there with her head lowered and kept flipping through it seriously. Suddenly, a scream came from a place about 10 meters behind her. Ah! At first, Feng Ling ignored them, but then she heard the people behind her fleeing in panic. Tokyo bandits. It's the Tokyo bandits. There were often gun murders in Western countries and major cities. The Tokyo bandits, as the name suggested, were a robbery force formed by a few Japanese martial artists. They all had guns in their hands and were skilled. They had been committing crimes in England. The last time she heard of them killing and robbing was more than 2 months ago. At that time they robbed a gold shop. The money and gold inside were enough for them to live for a long time. It seemed like they were short of money again. They actually dared to appear in the business center of London. Listening to the noise and screams behind her, Feng Ling's expression did not change. She continued to read the book in her hand as though she had heard nothing. She frowned unhappily because the screams behind her affected her mood. Bang! One of the bandits suddenly fired a shot at the light above the bookstore. In an instant, the lampshade shattered and scattered on the ground. Hearing the gunshot, the people shouted even more excitedly, but it seemed like the Tokyo bandits were guarding the front and back doors. In the end, no one was able to escape. All of them shrank their necks in fear and hid inside. In the end, there were more people squeezing in. Feng Ling didn't know who bumped into her, but she closed the book in her hand expressionlessly. The group of people were panicking. Only a woman standing there with her back to them with a book in her hand did not seem to be in a hurry. A few of the Tokyo bandits saw her at a glance. Is that person deaf? Can't you hear the gunshot? I think he's deaf. A normal person would have been scared silly. Look at how many people are here. 1, 2, 3, tsk, more than 20 people are all scared like dead dogs, haha. After that, the Tokyo bandits shouted at the crowd in Chinese, "Don't move. Otherwise I'll kill you now. Hand over all the valuables you have." Hearing that the Tokyo bandits were shouting in Chinese, the British people present were all in disbelief. Why were they Chinese? Were these people not Tokyo bandits? Could it be that Chinese were robbing them? Feng Ling's fingers quietly stroked the edges of the book, her back facing the Tokyo bandits. They were all Asian. They were doing illegal things in a foreign country and pretending to be Chinese. They were really filthy to the extreme. That woman hasn't reacted yet. She's either scared or she hasn't heard anything. Go get her over here and start with her. One of the Tokyo bandits, who was probably at the level of a big brother, suddenly lowered his voice and instructed the person beside him. Then someone suddenly walked quickly toward Feng Ling. Seeing the man coming over with a gun, the people who had been hiding around Feng Ling scattered in fright. In the end, Feng Ling, who couldn't hear the situation, was left alone. Seeing the man approaching her with a fierce expression, some people in the crowd looked at her pitifully, feeling that this young girl might be about to be splattered with blood on the spot. The moment the man approached with a gun and pressed it against Feng Ling's waist, everyone in the bookstore held their breath in fright. Some timid women screamed in fright and quickly covered their ears with their hands. At the same time they closed their eyes. However, to everyone's surprise, when the young girl suddenly felt the gun behind her, she did not panic at all. Instead, she slowly and calmly stuffed the book in her hand back into the bookshelf as though nothing had happened. Then she slowly turned her head and coldly looked at the ferocious Tokyo bandits behind her. Moi, don't be anxious. Feng Ling is working hard to evolve. Asking for monthly votes. Chapter 1282. The Tokyo bandits immediately shouted something behind Feng Ling. It sounded like Chinese, but it also sounded like Japanese. When mixed together, it became a language that no one else could understand. However, they believed that not many people present could understand it. They just treated it as Chinese, so they immediately shouted a few more words. In between, there were a few words that could be understood. For example, they shouted in Chinese, "Do you want to live? Grandpa can let you live. Give me money. Don't pretend to be deaf and dumb." Feng Ling looked indifferently at the man holding the gun behind her. She suddenly curved her lips and said in a low voice. Although her voice was low, it was not that no one present could understand Chinese. In big cities and bustling streets like foreign countries, it was common to see Chinese people. One or two people heard her curse in Chinese. She scolded the Tokyo bandits for being an island tribe, and they immediately looked in her direction in surprise. However, the Tokyo bandits did not understand. He stared at her in confusion and asked in his not fluent Chinese, "Are you from China?" Feng Ling smiled lightly. Her smile looked harmless, especially now that she had long hair and was wearing one of the clothes that Jin Wan had forced her to buy some time ago. She looked very girlish, making people feel that she was just a weak young girl. She didn't answer but said word by word clearly, "You don't even know how to speak decent Chinese. A few barbarians from an island country dare to pretend to be your ancestors from thousands of years ago. Chinese people use knives and guns to kill enemies. They're not the same as you little Japanese people who kill themselves in front of the Emperor of Japan. Be careful." The Tokyo bandits didn't quite understand her words, but they could tell that she wasn't afraid of them at all. They immediately looked in her direction coldly. Seeing that the attention of many people in the bookstore was attracted by the young girl, the people closest to the front and back doors began to try to sneak out. However, just as they were about to escape, they were stopped. The gunshot rang out again. In an instant, screams rang out everywhere. In this chaotic moment, Feng Ling's hand suddenly grabbed the gun against her waist. She snatched the gun with one hand before the person behind her could react. With the other hand, she grabbed a transparent glass bottle with a green basket on top of the bookshelf and smashed it against the head of another person slightly closer to her. The moment that person was hit, she kicked the person behind him and rushed over nimbly. She snatched the gun from the person who had just been hit by the glass bottle. With two guns in her hands, she didn't have to worry about running out of bullets. She forcefully turned the gun in her hand and coldly fired a shot at the two people who were groaning in pain on the ground. The bullets hit their wrists, rendering them unable to participate in the battle. It was just a few armed robbers. Feng Ling didn't say anything. The moment the Tokyo bandits raised their guns and pointed them at her, she kicked the bookcase closest to her to block all the bullets coming at her. At the same time, she avoided the muzzles of those people and stretched out her hand under the cover of the bookcase to shoot the person at the edge. The people who were hijacked in the bookstore didn't know what had happened. That young and beautiful girl just now actually had such a good background? She actually fought against them in front of so many armed bandits? Even a young girl knew how to resist. Some of the men in the bookstore subconsciously tried to hide behind other bookcases. At the same time, they kept grabbing the heavy books and throwing them at the bandits. They wanted to help and try to save themselves. Feng Ling took advantage of the fact that the books were flying randomly to distract those people's vision. She suddenly raised her other gun and shot at the foot of the person who was rushing over. Then she aimed it at his head and glanced coldly at the other party. At the same time, the other party was shocked and did not dare to step forward. She suddenly kicked away the person who had fallen to the ground and tried to grab her leg. She turned around and suddenly leaped forward. She used her elbows, knees, calves and feet to hit all of them. She snatched all their guns and threw them into the fish tank in the corner of the bookstore. When the few people who were skilled wanted to go forward to restrain her, she smashed the butt of the gun in her hand against their necks. She did not forget her close combat moves. It was just a few Tokyo bandits. In the blink of an eye, they all fell to the ground. They lay on the ground in pain and cursed. This time they were all in their own language. Hearing their words, the people present instantly understood. These people were actually pretending to be Chinese. They were clearly the rumored Tokyo bandits, but they were so despicable that they dared to pretend to be Chinese to cause trouble abroad. "You? Who exactly are you?" One of the Tokyo bandits, who had his wrist almost shattered by Feng Ling's stomp, fell to the ground in pain and asked her with difficulty. Feng Ling lowered her eyes and looked at him coldly. She did not answer. Instead, she threw the last gun in her hand into the fish tank in the corner and turned to leave. Earlier, she did not find the book she wanted, but she remembered the name of the book that had attracted her. She wanted to buy it in another bookstore and take it home on the weekend to read it. The painful groans behind her continued, and the sound of a police car was approaching. Feng Ling walked toward the door leading to the mall without looking back. In front of the door, there were two Tokyo bandits who did not have guns staring at her. She looked at them expressionlessly and coldly. In the end, the two of them did not dare to stop her. Under her gaze, they quickly looked away, turned around, and quickly ran in to help their accomplices up and escape. Feng Ling ignored what was happening behind her. No matter how the London police dealt with it, it had nothing to do with her. After all, her actions were only self-defense and she did not kill anyone. The few of them were in a mess and it was enough for the police to be busy. No one would take the time to pester her. However, as soon as she walked into the mall, she wanted to find a door that led to the outside and leave quickly. She did not plan to waste time here. She still had to go to the bookstore. However, she did not expect to suddenly run into Mr. Ian, who had appeared out of nowhere. Their eyes met. Ian's gaze was like a torch landing on her body. At the same time, he saw a trace of blood on her wrist. Feng Ling's back was indeed good, but those people had a lot of weapons in their hands. One of them was carrying a knife. Although he was cut down by her in the end, his wrist was still cut in the snatching. Chapter 1283. Although it was only a superficial wound and did not bleed much, Feng Ling felt a little uncomfortable being seen by a stranger like this. In the past 6 months, she had never fought with anyone in England. When she was by Jin Wan's side, she could only intimidate her. After all, MN Group also had security guards and professional bodyguards. Feng Ling was here to learn. Jin Wan didn't really want her to bother protecting her, so Feng Ling basically didn't fight much. Today was the first time she had fought since she came to England. In the end, it caused such a big commotion. She only looked at Ian for a moment and left without saying anything. However, the tall mixed-race man strode over without saying a word. The moment Feng Ling turned around and took a few steps, he suddenly grabbed her wrist. Although he avoided the wound on her wrist, he held it tightly. "You're injured. I'll take you to bandage it." Although Feng Ling had been in 11 base for many years and didn't feel much from her brothers, this man was different from her previous brothers. She was so sensitive that she wanted to pull her hand out, but the man held it even tighter. She frowned. "Let go." Ian lowered his eyes to look at her. "I said you're injured and need to bandage it. It's just a small injury. Just buy a band-aid." Feng Ling turned to look at him. "Mr. Ian, please let go of my hand. I'm not as open-minded as you British. It's not polite to hold someone's wrist in public." Ian retracted his hand and glanced at her again. Then he turned to look at the bookstore that was surrounded by the London police. "I passed by and didn't know what happened inside, but I suddenly saw you kick someone down." Feng Ling. He lowered his eyes to look at her. "I didn't know that apart from your bad temper, you're actually so powerful. Even a few men with guns can't beat you." "Miss Feng, I really can't help but be curious. What's your background?" Feng Ling was silent for a moment. Mr. Zand only knew that she was the second daughter of the Feng family who had lost and recovered. He knew that she had grown up in a military base, so her personality was a little tough. This was Mr. Zand's understanding of her. Ian definitely did not know much about her. She didn't want to answer and just walked away. Ian couldn't remember how many times he had seen this little woman's stubborn and indifferent back. The distance she maintained in front of others made people feel the weakness and untouchability hidden in her heart. He looked at her and said a few words to the secretary behind him. He told the secretary to talk about the department store today, then turned around and walked out. Feng Ling returned to the car and placed her hand on the steering wheel. Only then did she see that although the wound on her wrist was not big, it was quite deep. No wonder Ian saw it. The blood had rubbed against her clothes. She was wearing a light-colored set today, and there was a large patch of blood on her leg. It wasn't that he couldn't feel the pain. It was just that he had gotten used to being injured all over his body over the years. On the contrary, he hadn't been injured much recently, so the sudden pain really stung him. She felt that her hands were not steady when holding the steering wheel. She was about to find a wet towel in the car to wipe the blood off her wrist when the door to the front passenger seat suddenly opened. Ian opened the door and sat in without saying a word. Feng Ling paused and stared at him. "What are you doing? How can I drive with my hand injured like this?" Ian crossed his fingers and casually placed them on his lap. He turned to look at her. "I don't have anything to do today. Since you're my brother's student, I'll send you to the hospital." Feng Ling's gaze was cold. "No need. Please get out of the car." Ian had no intention of leaving, nor did he speak. He just looked at her indifferently. It seemed that a successful person like Ian, especially in his 30s, was not as young as Qiao Fei and Qin Beiqing she had met in the past. This kind of man was not easy to deal with, especially when he made a decision. Furthermore, he was the vice president of the bank. He had so many subordinates under him and he was used to giving orders. This kind of aura was not easy to push away. Feng Ling knew that this kind of person was not easy to deal with. She was not in the mood to deal with him. She frowned and said, "Mr. Ian, are you British so rude to get into someone else's car without being invited?" "Don't say we're British. Half of my blood is Chinese." Ian looked at her indifferently. "Miss Feng, I'm concerned about you." "Thank you for your concern, but I don't need it." Feng Ling's expression remained cold. "I'm warning you one last time. Please get out of the car." Ian smiled and raised his hand to make an inviting gesture. "If you can drive the car 500 meters away smoothly, I'll get out." Feng Ling took a deep breath and expressionlessly retracted her gaze. She started the engine and drove the car away. It was just that her wrist was a little painful, but it was not to the extent that she could not drive. However, after driving for about 500 meters, she subconsciously wanted to stop the car and let him get out. However, she neglected the situation at the nearby intersection. After driving here, she was not allowed to stop. Even if she wanted to violate the traffic laws, she could not stop at all. There were many cars behind, and a slight delay would cause a serious traffic jam. Seeing that the car could not be stopped, Feng Ling's expression became even worse. As she drove, she said coldly, "Mr. Ian, you're so scheming." Ian smiled calmly and pointed ahead with his chin. "There's a hospital 3 kilometers ahead. Go and bandage it. I'll leave after seeing that your wrist is bandaged." Feng Ling couldn't stop the car right now, so she had no other choice but to drive forward. However, when she drove to the hospital, she unbuckled her seatbelt and said, "Are you sending me to the hospital or should I send you to the hospital?" Ian chuckled. "It's the same meaning. Can't you drive? If you like to drive by yourself, I'll let you. However, I still have to watch you bandage it. Otherwise, I don't think you take your body seriously. It's very likely that you'll go back directly. If you get infected by the water and have a fever after the infection, I'm afraid no one will see you faint at home at night. It's not that serious." "I can see if it's serious." AI could push the car away. "Let's go bandage it." Chapter 1284. This person's back view was too similar to that of the man in Los Angeles. She retracted her cold gaze, took out the electronic car key, locked the car door and followed him into the hospital. It was just a very simple skin wound. After the doctor stopped the bleeding and disinfected it, he wrapped it with gauze. Originally there was no need to wrap the gauze, but Ian insisted. In the end, because her wrist was tied up, when she walked out of the hospital, she looked in the direction of her car and realized that this man was really scheming. She really couldn't drive anymore. "I'll help you drive the car back. Where do you live?" Ian walked by her side and signaled her with his eyes to give her the car key. Feng Ling was not someone who liked to compromise, especially when she was facing a man who knew how to play tricks. At this moment, her phone rang. She picked up her phone and answered the call. "Hello, Xiaoba. And no, I'm not home. I'm in the hospital now." "It's fine. I encountered something just now. There's a scratch on my wrist. I came to the hospital to deal with it." There's no need to tell Jinuan. The company has been so busy recently. It's not easy for her to have a good weekend. Don't let her worry. And you can come over if you want. Help me drive the car back. "All right, I'll send you the location later." Feng Ling hung up the phone and turned to look at Ian. "Sorry, my friend will be here soon. She can send me back. She can also drive the car for me." "Thank you, Mr. Ian." Ian raised his brows slightly. "Why do you always guard against me as if you're guarding against a thief? Do I have ulterior motives toward you or something?" "No, you're thinking too much. I'm just not used to being too close to strangers. I've seen you a few times. You're still a stranger? Are we very familiar with each other?" Feng Ling asked. Seeing that she didn't give him any space to take advantage of, Ian had met countless scheming and shrewd women at his age, but he had never seen such a stubborn woman. The key was that when she could clearly see that he was interested in her, she kept him at a distance of 1,000 miles. If this was her way of seducing men, he could only congratulate her on her success. However, she didn't do it on purpose. She really didn't want to have anything to do with him. "All right, I won't argue with you." Ian glanced at her car. "I'll accompany you to the car and wait. I'll leave when your friend comes." Feng Ling did not say anything and walked toward her car. No matter what, Ian had arranged for her to go to the hospital. He had also asked someone to quickly call a doctor to bandage her wound, so that she wouldn't have to wait in line. He still had to be courteous at the end. After returning to the car, Feng Ling sat in the driver's seat, picked up her coat and put it on. The sleeve of the coat was just enough to cover the white gauze on her wrist. Then she picked up her phone and kept looking at it, ignoring the man sitting in the passenger seat. In the end, the phone was suddenly taken away from her hand. She looked at the empty phone and turned to see Ian holding her phone smoothly and calling his own phone. Feng Ling watched him. "What are you doing? Give me your number. In the future we'll know each other and no longer be strangers." Ian was very direct. After obtaining her phone number, he did not do anything else. Before she flew into a rage, he handed the phone back to her. "Don't worry, I'm also very busy. I don't have so much time to disturb you, but since we're both single, it shouldn't be too much to contact each other when we're not busy. It doesn't violate any moral standards. You can be uninterested in me, but it doesn't stop me from being interested in you. There's still a long way to go." Feng Ling reached out and snatched her phone. Seeing that he had saved her phone number into his address book, she was clearly unhappy. "You're not being polite. If I'm too polite, I won't be able to chase after the woman I like. Were all men so shameless when chasing after women nowadays?" Sure enough, only the cold and aloof Mr. Mo was the most pleasing to the eye. Back then, other than being good to Jin Wan, his attitude towards everyone else was so cold, as though they were worlds apart. He would never do anything to make things difficult for others. Even when it came to Jin Wan, he treated her with sincerity. He would never play such a messy trick. She did not speak anymore and did not want to communicate with this person. She just looked at the time on her phone impatiently, waiting for Xiaoba to come over. At this moment, the man beside her suddenly reached out his arm and leaned closer. When Feng Ling turned to look at him, the man had already placed one hand on the steering wheel in front of her and the other on the seat behind her. Although he did not pull the distance too close, his action of imprisoning her in the driver's seat still made Feng Ling's eyelids twitch. "How deeply hurt are you to hide your heart so well?" Ian looked into her eyes. "You're young. You shouldn't be so dull." Feng Ling looked away expressionlessly and could not be bothered to answer. Los Angeles, America. Li Corporation. CO Li. The secretary Yu Zheng knocked on the door and entered the CEO's office. He walked in with a few meeting documents in his hand. When the man walked in, he was actually a little nervous. After all, Li Nanheng had been back to take over the Li Corporation for a few months. Although he was swift and decisive, he had made the company look like he had changed a layer of skin, and the whole company had entered a state of slow improvement. In the past 6 months, the Li Corporation had been in the best state in recent years, but CEO Li was good at everything except for his temper. Furthermore, his temper was extremely bad. Usually, other than the necessary work relationship, he rarely communicated with the assistants and secretaries in the company. However, CEO Li did have an assistant named Xiao Su by his side. It was said that he had followed CEO Li out of 11 base and had been with him for many years. He was efficient, diligent, and tight-lipped. Other than communicating more with Xiao Su, CEO Li spent most of his time working with a sullen face. He rarely smiled. Therefore, although everything in the Li Corporation had been developing in a good direction in the past 6 months, this CEO Li, who never gave anyone a good look, really made the secretaries and assistants who had to face him tremble with fear every day. Chapter 1285. From the beginning, the words were clearly written on CEO Li's face. "I'm not in a good mood right now." After the meeting was suspended, everyone heaved a sigh of relief and quickly returned to their respective posts to avoid being affected. After all, if CEO Li was really ruthless, he could fire all the heads of several departments at the same time. Half a year ago, when he first took over the Li Corporation, he had changed the blood of these people. It was not impossible now. Everyone avoided him as much as they could. After all, CEO Li's expression when he looked at his phone was frighteningly bad. Yu Zheng was unlucky. As a secretary, he had to bite the bullet and come to deliver the meeting documents. CEO Li. After Yu Zheng put down the document, he saw Li Nanheng sitting on the leather chair behind the desk. He leaned against it and did not speak. His expression was still cold. He did not continue to look at his phone, but he was holding it in his hand. It looked like he was about to crush it on the spot. After hesitating for a moment, he tried his best to speak in a voice that was filled with a strong desire to live. "This is the information from the meeting just now." Although the meeting was only half done, the information that was sorted out and the summary of the various departments that need to be submitted have also been summarized. "Please take a look." Li Nanheng glanced at the document that was suddenly put down on the table. His cold eyes gradually regained some focus. "Do you need me to go to England recently, or can you arrange for me to go on a business trip to England?" England? Yu Zheng was startled for a moment. He did not understand why he suddenly wanted to go to England, but he still seriously picked up the tablet and checked it for a while before answering. "CEO Li, you don't have any plans to go to England recently." Instead, you have a lot of things to do in Washington, Los Angeles, and New York. Recently, the cooperation with the Lee Corporation has been expanding better and better. There are more and more occasions that require you to appear personally. These are all things that you have to go personally. As for England, Yu Zheng looked at the last few pages on the tablet. Oh, in 3 months, there will be an exhibition in Los Angeles with the British Diplomatic Corps. This was just decided not long ago, but the people from England are coming, not you. Li Nanheng rubbed his brows. Arrange something for me to do in England. Yu Zheng was really dumbfounded. The Lee Corporation did not have much contact with the companies in England, and there were not many activities that required Li Nanheng to personally go to England. However, CEO Li had personally spoken, so he probably had something to do in England. President Li, do you know MN Group in London? Yu Zheng asked. Li Nanheng frowned and glanced at him. I know. What happened to MN Group? We have a cooperation document sent by MN Group when it was just a small studio. At that time it was suppressed and never brought to the table. Now that the small studio has transformed into MN Group, its strength cannot be underestimated. Now we can take out this cooperation document and take a closer look. If we can really cooperate, perhaps CEO Li, you really need to go to England in person. Jin Wan's previous studio had sent a cooperation application to the Lee Corporation. It was probably because he hadn't returned to the Lee Group yet. Otherwise, if he were here, if he refused Jin Wan's studio's request, Mo Jingshan would be the first to make trouble for him. Give it to me, let me have a look. All right. Yu Zheng quickly called the secretary's office to find the cooperation application document. The secretary's office was very efficient, especially when they heard that CEO Li wanted to see it. 10 minutes later, there was a knock on the door of the CEO's office. Another secretary came in to deliver the document. Yu Zheng took it, opened the bag on the document, sorted out the order, and placed it in front of Li Nanheng. Although this secretary was a man, he had been in the Lee Corporation for many years. He was thorough. His cousin Li Jintz had always praised this secretary when she was managing the company. Although Li Nanheng didn't communicate much with him, he had to admit that he was indeed a very good assistant. He glanced at Yu Zheng again and picked up the document to read. Seeing that CEO Li didn't want to talk much, Yu Zheng winked at the other secretary, and the two of them quietly left. The office returned to silence. Li Nanheng looked at the contents of the document and flipped to the next page. Before Mr. Feng passed away, he had promised to let Feng Ling leave 11 Base and let her return to the peaceful and happy life that a normal girl should have. After Feng Ling returned to the Feng family, he had promised grandfather Feng to give Feng Ling some time to slowly grow up in the world outside the base. If Feng Ling didn't take the initiative to contact him, he would give her more time. Only when she had no worries and no one behind her would she wholeheartedly find a breakthrough and not be limited to her past experiences. It had been half a year. Feng Ling had been in England for half a year, and Li Nanheng had been forced back by grandfather Li to take over the family business for half a year. She was studying hard and flying high outside. He was also in Los Angeles, stripping away his identity as the person in charge of 11 Base. He stayed in this hugely corporation and looked at the boring financial figures and documents that needed his signature all day long. He dealt with those business elites who killed without spilling blood. Feng Ling had gone to Mr. Zan's side to study for a year. It had only been half a year. Li Nanheng knew that everything was going smoothly and safely with her by Jin Wan's side. He could completely grasp her learning progress and current situation. He was sure that she was fine. Occasionally he could see a few photos sent by the informant. However, an hour ago, after receiving the informant's photo and understanding what had just happened, Xiao Su called to report. In the photo, the mixed-race man who went in and out of the mall and hospital with Feng Ling kept his gaze on Feng Ling's man. After all, he understood men. He could tell that it was a man's gaze when he saw prey he was interested in. There were also a few photos of Feng Ling and the mixed-race man sitting in the car. That person's posture was ambiguous and domineering. Feng Ling looked at him in the car and was very close. Xiao Su said on the phone, "This person's name is Ian. He's the vice president of the London International Bank and Mr. Zan's younger brother. I haven't seen him much before. Recently he often appears by Feng Ling's side. He's 33 years old and is one of the representatives of a very capable financial businessman." Li Nanheng glanced at the photo of Ian and Feng Ling in the car on his phone. He pressed the document in his hand on the desk and pressed the internal phone. Yu Zheng, arrange a cooperation channel with London's MN Group. Chapter 1286. Xiaoba came just in time. Seeing that a friend had really come to pick her up and drive her home, Ian did not force her. He got out of the car and smiled at Feng Ling through the window. Feng Ling's gaze shifted from the rearview mirror and she sat expressionlessly in the front passenger seat. Xiao Ba, who had already occupied the driver's seat, noticed the man outside the car as she drove away. She asked with a smile, "Isn't this Mr. Ian? Why did you meet him? Since he's here, why didn't you ask him to send you home?" "I'm not familiar with him. Why would I ask him to send me back?" Feng Ling's tone was indifferent. Xiao Ba was already used to Feng Ling's cold temper. She chuckled and said, "Last time COG said that Mr. Ian was interested in you. I heard her say it." Feng Ling chuckled. "There are quite a few people who are interested in Jin Wan. Have you ever seen her bother with them?" Xiao Ba didn't comment on this. After all, Feng Ling was telling the truth. Usually, Feng Ling was a very low-key person who didn't appear much, but she was still remembered by others. Furthermore, in the past few years in England after her divorce, Jin Wan had lived more and more brightly and confidently. As the person in charge of MN Group, she had to deal with all kinds of social occasions. The men who extended an olive branch to her could even circle around MN Group, but Jin Wan just didn't like anyone. She didn't even mention anything about men. She didn't mention Mo Jingshan or other men. She clearly showed off in all kinds of social occasions every day and wore a fiery red dress that gave her a different kind of charm. However, she just didn't look at any men. Other than work, she didn't even have any plans to find someone else to fall in love with. For example, the general manager of BGY often came to London on business trips and helped Jin Wan's career a lot. However, Jin Wan only thanked him and didn't have any intention of developing a relationship with him. Jin Wan looked like everything was fine. She lived a positive life and lived like a nun in private. Not to mention Feng Ling's indifferent personality. Xiao Ba shook her head. "You and COG are the same. You met the best one from the beginning, causing no man to enter your eyes in the future." Feng Ling did not speak. She only placed her hand on her bandaged wrist. When the car passed by another bookstore, she asked Xiao Ba to stop the car. She went to buy the book she wanted, got into the car and asked Xiao Ba to send her home. A week later, Feng Ling was going through the documents of the last meeting in the MN Group conference room. Jin Wan had just ended the meeting and returned to the office, but she suddenly came back. Seeing that it was Jin Wan who pushed open the door of the conference room and walked in, Feng Ling only raised her head to look at her before lowering her head to look at the things in her hands seriously. "I have some good news and some bad news." "There's one good news and one bad news. Which one do you want to hear first?" Feng Ling did not raise her head. She flipped through the documents in her hands. "It doesn't matter which one I listen to first. Which one do you want to speak first?" Jin Wan chuckled, crossed her arms, leaned casually against the table and looked down at her. "I'm not sure which one is good news for you and which one is bad news for you." Hearing that it was related to her, Feng Ling glanced at her. "Why are you keeping me guessing?" "First of all, the Lee Corporation in Los Angeles contacted our company's development department. They plan to cooperate with MN. This is good news. After all, the Lee Corporation is a big piece of fat meat in Los Angeles, and their family foundation is strong. Not any small company can get close to them. If we can cooperate with such a company, it will be of great help to MN, Jin Wan said. Hearing Jin Wan's words, Feng Ling nodded. That's good news. The bad news is that Li Nanheng has completely taken over the management of the Li Corporation. The person in charge of this cooperation is CEO Li himself. The two of them will come to England, London, and our place in the next few days, Jin Wan said as she lowered her head to look at Feng Ling. Sure enough, Feng Ling paused and then raised her eyes to meet her gaze. Jin Wan raised her eyebrows at her. Her eyes were clearly saying that everything she said was true and that she was not joking with her. When it came to company matters, Jin Wan never joked. This business cooperation couldn't be missed, but since Jin Wan came to talk to her, it was clear that she wanted to hear Feng Ling's thoughts. If Feng Ling didn't want to, Jin Wan would rather lose this cooperation opportunity than make things difficult for Feng Ling. Feng Ling retracted her gaze, closed the document in her hand and leaned back in her chair. She was silent for a few minutes. Jin Wan didn't say much and just watched her expression. After a long time she asked, Feng Ling, what plans do you have? Aren't you going to send someone back to High City to deliver something? Let me send it, Feng Ling said. However, Jin Wan shook her head gently. Mr. Zan said that your grandfather told you not to leave England and not to wander around alone. You must ensure that you are always under Mr. Zan's eyes. The Feng family only had Feng Ling left. Grandfather Feng was very concerned about her safety and didn't want to see anything happen to her. He also firmly believed that as long as Feng Ling learned by Mr. Zan's side, her personality would be suppressed and restrained. He definitely wouldn't allow her to leave alone. Feng Ling looked at Jin Wan. I don't want to see him. Her relationship with Jin Wan was so good that she didn't need to hide her thoughts. She didn't have any reason to be coquettish. She just spoke the truth. She didn't have any thoughts. She just didn't want to see him. Jin Wan clicked her tongue. Do you know what happened when I sent that application to the Li Corporation? At that time I was just a small studio, and the person in charge of the Li Corporation wasn't Li Nanheng. It was equivalent to my cooperation application not being accepted by them and being shelved. However, Li Nanheng specially dug out something from so long ago and even came to London personally. What do you think he came to London for? Does a company with a solid foundation like the Li Corporation need a business cooperation contract from a new company like me? He clearly came to look for you. However, the reason for business cooperation is more open and above board. Jin Wan was becoming more and more clear-headed. She directly broke through the fog in front of Feng Ling's eyes. The problem between you and Li Nanheng isn't like that between me and Mo Jingshan. I was the one who was left behind by your Mr. Mo. There's no way back. I can only grit my teeth and endure it. But you're different. You can return to Li Nanheng's side. As long as you want, he will definitely open his arms and wait for you to go over. Chapter 1287. However, Feng Ling stood up and gently tossed the documents in her hands onto the table. She coldly said, I don't want to. With that she turned to leave. Jin Wan also walked out. As she walked by her side she said, if you really don't want to see her then don't. I can also respect your decision regarding the cooperation. You can talk about the business cooperation as you want. Just don't bring me out. I'll be studying at Mr. Zan's house this week. If I don't have time I might stay at his place. After all, he has a lot of rooms. It's convenient for me to have a bedroom. Seeing Feng Ling's determination, Jin Wan understood her thoughts and nodded. All right then. 2 days later Li Nanheng arrived but found nothing. No matter what the occasion was, Feng Ling did not appear at all, nor did she come out with Jin Wan. He looked for opportunities to wait for several days but did not see her. In the end, before he was about to sign the cooperation contract with MN Group, Li Nanheng stood in Jin Wan's office and expressionlessly tossed a stack of contracts on her desk. He asked coldly, where is she? Jin Wan sat behind the desk and looked at him calmly. She bluntly said, she doesn't want to see you. She took a few days off from me and didn't come to the company. Li Nanheng coldly glanced at her. Xiaoji, you're so blunt now. Jin Wan chuckled lightly, but her smile did not reach her eyes. We can be considered old friends. I'm just saying what I want to say. Do I have to tactfully tell you that Feng Ling is not here? Or why is she not here? Isn't the reason because she doesn't want to see you? Why did I beat around the bush? Isn't it a waste of breath? He narrowed his eyes coldly and stared at her face. That's good. After all, she's still studying in London. If there's no problem, I won't disturb her progress. Since COG is so independent and even wants to interfere with Feng Ling's matters, why don't you keep an eye on her private life and let her work hard and study hard during her studies abroad? Don't get too close to those men who appear out of nowhere. Jin Wan nodded and said, you're right, Feng Ling, don't worry. Jin Wan had been maintaining a cold expression. When she heard these words, she almost collapsed. With some difficulty, she looked at the man in front of her who was warning her seriously but was clearly jealous of her. She continued to maintain a cold expression. I don't care about Feng Ling's private life, but based on the relationship between sisters and friends, I feel that as long as it doesn't affect her learning progress, it's not a bad choice to let her interact with others occasionally and forget the people and things in the past as soon as possible. Li Nanheng said solemnly, do you think she is you? What's the difference between her and me now? She knows how to endure better than me, but once this kind of person who is used to enduring explodes, no one can bear the consequences. I believe she should have already exploded. Otherwise, you wouldn't be so helpless against her now. Jin Wan was no longer pretending to be cold but really indifferent. A layer of frost appeared between Li Nanheng's cold brows, but he did not explain anything. He only said, since she is with you now, you should keep an eye on her. You know what I mean. Don't mess around and harm others and yourself. Her mind can't hold more things. If you dare to randomly send people to her, in the end she will be filled with self-blame and guilt, or if she can't leave some unnecessary circles, she will become a psychological burden. Jin Wan, when my temper is bad, I won't give Mo Jingshan face. Originally, Jin Wan had always been joking. How could she really mess around? However, Li Nanheng's last sentence still caused Jin Wan's expression to freeze. Whether you give Mo Jingshan face or not, what does it have to do with me? Jin Wan was expressionless. Am I very familiar with him? Li Nanheng only sneered. He glanced at the contract in front of her, picked up the pen and signed it. He then threw the pen down and turned to leave without looking back. Xiaoba saw Li Nanheng's back and softly exclaimed. She then pushed the door open and walked in. Oh my god, so cool. I've never seen this legendary Mr. Li before. I didn't expect him to be so handsome. He is Feng Ling's? Jin Wan's expression was cold because Li Nanheng had mentioned Mo Jingshan. The moment Xiaoba entered, she felt that the atmosphere was not right and quickly shut her mouth. Seeing that the business cooperation contract had been signed, she walked forward to pick it up and left. She did not dare to speak anymore. Feng Ling did not want to see him. Seeing that she was still studying, Li Nanheng did not look for her. Even though he knew that she was at Mr. Zan's place and could use the fact that he had some relationship with Mr. Zan to capture her, he still gave her time to study quietly and did not disturb her. However, before Li Nanheng left London, he warned Mr. Zan to tell his brother to stay away from Feng Ling and not to touch women he shouldn't touch. Otherwise, it was hard to say if he would personally visit London again. At that time, it would not be as simple as a warning. In the next few months, although Mr. Ian still maintained a considerable interest in Feng Ling was like a block of wood. She did not even agree to treat him to a meal. When she saw him, she would always take a detour. Later on, she even became smarter. Every time she went to Mr. Zan's house, she would ask someone to drive with her, thus avoiding the opportunity for him to send her home. In short, she did not give him any chance at all. Most importantly, because of Li Nanheng, Mr. Zan maintained some doubts about Feng Ling's past. Previously, he had only thought that she was a little girl who had finally returned to the Feng family after suffering outside for a few years. He did not expect that her relationship with Li Nanheng was not simple. A smart person like Mr. Zan had always known how to act appropriately, so he did not take the initiative to matchmake them. Although Li Nanheng did not see Feng Ling, the deterrent effect of coming to London was enough to achieve his goal. Los Angeles, America. Li Corporation. Li Nanheng leaned against the leather chair behind the desk. He played with the pen on the table with one hand and closed his eyes to listen to Xiao Su's report. On August 20th, Feng Ling and Jin Wan went to Paris to participate in Busling's debut show. They stayed in France for a week and met several French partners. On September 3rd, Feng Ling met the general manager of London's GK Corporation alone and discussed a cooperation worth 400 million yuan. On September 8th, Feng Ling. Then, when he mentioned the charity banquet sponsored by the London International Bank, Mr. Ian personally invited Feng Ling to attend as his female companion. Xiao Su looked at the report below and paused for a moment. He raised his eyes to look at Li Nanheng, who was calm and composed, as though he was sure that Feng Ling would not attend. On September 15th, Feng Ling attended the charity banquet as Mr. Ian's female companion. The London business media recognized her as Mr. Ian's girlfriend. Li Nanheng abruptly opened his eyes. Io Li ha miscalculated. Now that little Feng Ling has studied in England for a year, he can officially go snatch a wife. Chapter 1288. London, MN Group. Feng Ling had been studying in England for a year, and the progress of her studies had almost been completed. According to Grandfather Feng's wishes, he planned to let her return to America soon and return to the Feng family, which was currently in New York, to take over several businesses under the Feng Corporation's name. He wanted her to gradually adapt to being independent. This way, her future path would be more perfect and she would be able to apply what she had learned. However, there were still some unfinished matters that she had not finished, so she was not in a hurry to leave. She was used to helping Jin Wan and returning home after she was done. As soon as she walked out, she saw the blue Bugatti parked there. It had been so long. Even though she had not been in Mr. Ian's car many times, she could recognize it at a glance. It had only been a day since she went to the charity dinner as his female companion. Feng Ling thought that she could always live in peace with this Mr. Ian. She had always been wary of such a shrewd man and had never really wanted to approach him. Perhaps because he knew that she was leaving England recently, this Mr. Ian seemed to have suddenly changed his way of pursuing her. In the past he only appeared occasionally, but because he could not get a response from her, he had never put down his pride to do anything. Recently he had appeared more frequently. He either asked her to be his female companion or said that he had a gathering at his villa in the suburbs of London. He invited her to go with him and there were all kinds of invitations. His proactive attitude was obvious. He had changed from the initial reserved and steady way of pursuing her to a more obvious way of pursuing her. However, from beginning to end, Feng Ling only agreed to the dinner party. The reason was actually because of Mr. Zan's concern, which was why she agreed to go. Jin Wan and Xiao Ba were supposed to go that day, but because Jin Wan had a business partner to meet with, Feng Ling had no choice but to go on behalf of MN Group. Originally, she had rejected Ian's invitation, but a few hours before the dinner party began, she had suddenly agreed. At that time she was in a hurry to attend. Originally, she wanted to wear a simple set of clothes, but Ian said that she couldn't be too casual on such an occasion, so he specially drove her to an image customization center and asked someone to change her gown, do her hair, put on exquisite makeup and put on high heels. At that time, Feng Ling was in a hurry, so she had no choice but to listen to the arrangements. In the end, when she came out, even a man like Ian, who had been used to seeing love for more than 30 years, was stunned. She looked like a Cinderella who had turned into a princess. The key thing was that her eyes seemed to despise the cumbersome dresses and hairstyle she was wearing. This kind of gaze made it easy for people to lose their minds. On the day of the banquet, Feng Ling sat in his car, listened to his arrangements, and entered the banquet with him as his female companion. However, she didn't realize that there would be reporters at the scene. Today, when she saw the various rumors released by the business media, Feng Ling did not take it seriously. She wasn't a celebrity in the entertainment industry, so she didn't mind this kind of scandal. After all, after closing the door, she had nothing to do with Mr. Ian, so she didn't need to explain. But why was he here again? Feng Ling pretended not to see it and was about to go to the parking lot in front to find her car. However, the moment she walked to the roadside, the blue Bugatti drove over and stopped in front of her. She paused in her steps and looked at the car window that was slowly rolling down. Ian gave her a look for her to get in the car. Feng Ling looked at him calmly. "What's the matter?" Ian smiled and casually placed one hand on the steering wheel. He looked at her sideways. "We've known each other for so long. We can't be considered strangers. You know my situation pretty well. Even if you don't want to be my girlfriend, you shouldn't be so wary. It's not like you'll lose a piece of meat if you get in my car." "I won't lose any meat, but there's no need," Feng Ling said bluntly. She had always been the kind of person who didn't like to cause trouble for herself. She knew that it was impossible for her to like him, so she never gave them any chance to get close to each other. The dinner party the night before yesterday was just a special case. At that time she had only gone to the London International Bank on Jin Wan's behalf, but it didn't mean that she had given Ian face. Yes, there's no need." Ian reached out to open the front passenger seat door. "I'll take you to see something. After seeing it we'll leave. I won't hold you back." Feng Ling did not move. "You're about to return to America. What else can I do?" Seeing that she was stubborn, Ian's eyes seemed to be helpless. "Miss Feng, give me some face. After all, I've always treated you well. No matter what, we're friends. You can't be so heartless and cold to friends." Feng Ling glanced at the time and then at him. "What are you bringing me to see? Get in the car. I'll show you. You'll know. Don't say that I've never had any ill intentions towards you. Even if I did, I'm afraid I wouldn't be able to defeat you. Get in the car in peace." Ian smiled. There was a trace of impatience in Feng Ling's eyes. She hated dealing with these feelings that exceeded her expectations, but she did not hate Ian very much. This man was very smart and gentlemanly. He would not do anything to annoy her and would always stop at the right time. She opened the car door and sat in. As she fastened her seat belt, she asked lightly, "Where to? How far? How long?" "Very close. Half an hour." She raised her head to look out of the car window and suddenly said these words. Ian understood what she meant by giving him only half an hour. Perhaps because he was in a high position, he had been pestered by those passionate women for a long time, and his feelings for them were very indifferent. However, Feng Ling, who hid all the thorns in her body and coldly forbade anyone from approaching, became his favorite. She gradually became a cinnabar mole in his heart. Gradually he was unwilling to maintain such a distant relationship. He still wanted to conquer her. However, it was difficult for him to do it. He couldn't do it if it was cold, hot, or close. Perhaps he could only attack her heart, bit by bit, slowly. Ian drove the car to the London International Bank building. This building was 70 stories tall. It was considered above average among the various high-rise buildings in London. There was a very wide and huge rooftop above it. After getting out of the car, Ian gestured for her to follow him. Feng Ling didn't understand, but she still followed. The two of them walked into the elevator and she saw Ian press the button for the rooftop. She immediately glanced at him in confusion. Why are we going to the rooftop of your building? Ian smiled. I'm taking you to the rooftop to threaten you. I'll stand on it and force you to be my girlfriend. If you refuse, I'll jump down. He wanted to chat with more like-minded people about the warm wind isn't as deep as your love. Chat about life and find a bosom friend. Chapter 1289. Feng Ling was expressionless. Mr. Ian's joke isn't funny. Ian chuckled. Then what if I really jump? Feng Ling glanced at him coldly. Then jump. I won't stop you. Tiske, you're really... Ian really loved and hated her temper. In the end, he could only grit his teeth. Although he wished he could pull her into his arms and kiss her to let him know that he wasn't so good-tempered and patient. Due to her temper, he knew that he couldn't be too impatient. Otherwise, he would only push her further away. They entered the elevator that only the higher-ups of the bank building could take, so they were unimpeded all the way. They didn't stop in the middle of the 70th floor and went straight to the top. After the elevator arrived, Ian looked at Feng Ling with a faint smile and reached out to invite her in. Feng Ling didn't understand and walked out. After stepping out of the elevator, she saw that there was a small staircase about 10 floors up to the rooftop. She walked over. The moment he walked up the stairs to the rooftop, he saw that the empty space in the middle of the rooftop, which was nearly 1,000 square meters, was covered with red roses. They were not petals but fresh red roses. In the middle there was also a huge heart made of white roses. Feng Ling paused in her tracks. Ian walked behind her. I know this method looks a little tacky, but according to my observation, your experience and everything about you are very simple. I don't know if this tacky way of expressing myself can enter your eyes, but at least I'm sincere. If I can get even a little bit of your heart, I'm willing to pave the entire street with flowers. Feng Ling, Ian walked up to her and lowered his eyes to look at her silent expression. I've invited you so many times, but you refused to have a meal with me. Since you're here today, why don't you have dinner here alone? Feng Ling turned to look at him. Mr. Ian, I think I should tell you, don't say anything. He reached out and held her wrist. When Feng Ling subconsciously wanted to pull her hand out, he looked at her firmly. At least, before you return to America, I have to leave something in your heart. Even if it's just a little trace, at least when I chase you to America, I still have a reason to see you. Feng Ling was led into the large rose field in front of them. She stepped on a small path in the middle until she saw an exquisite table. At this moment, Ian pressed a secret bell on the table. Immediately, someone brought up exquisite and luxurious carved candles and various exquisite dishes from various countries and placed them on the table one by one. After the table was filled, Ian gestured for them to leave. When there were only the two of them left, he walked over and pulled out a chair, gesturing for her to sit down. All the pursuits Feng Ling had experienced were Li Nanheng's pure straight man style of, I like you, I want you. That man had never even given her a decent flower, let alone a rose-paved road and a candlelight dinner. In her impression, Li Nanheng had only given her a small wooden hut in the jungle, but it was later burned down. As for his other temptations and pursuits, they were all simple liking. At that time, Qin Beiqing only gave her a bouquet of flowers every day, but she rejected them all. She didn't even look at them. She didn't have much experience when it came to relationships, so even though the scene looked very tacky, it was her first time. Seeing that Feng Ling didn't move, Ian turned around and pressed down on her shoulder, pressing her to sit on the chair. Since you're already here, give me some face. If you leave now, all the employees in this building will see me. You have to leave me some face. Feng Ling didn't say anything. She just sat there, looking at the candles on the table, and then at the nearly 1,000 square meters of roses under her feet. Needless to say, these flowers were very expensive, not to mention there were so many of them. Seeing that she seemed to be willing to compromise, Ian didn't resist too much. Although his silence made him look uncomfortable, it was a good start. He smiled and sat opposite her. After cutting the medium-well steak that had just been served, he pushed the steak in front of her and took the untouched plate in front of her to his side. He patiently cut it. Feng Ling watched his movements. Mr. Ian, I really don't know how to respond to your great kindness, but you should know my attitude very well. Even if I don't say it, you know it. I know. Ian patiently cut the steak. But after all, you're still single. I have the right to pursue you. I didn't think that I could win your heart today, but there's a saying in China that sincerity can split open metal and stone. After a long time, I'll find a breakthrough for you one day. Feng Ling did not eat the steak in front of her. She glanced at the wine glass by the side, which had already been poured with red wine. She picked up the wine glass and shook it in her hand. She chuckled. If my life hadn't changed so much from the age of 1, perhaps I would have experienced this many years ago. Flowers, red wine, a life so luxurious that I don't have to worry about food and clothes, beautiful gowns, expensive shoes. Unfortunately, Mr. Ian, you don't know much about my past, she said softly. She said softly, although I am indeed the daughter of the Feng family in the United States, in my eyes, any rose here is enough for me to have a full meal. I am also very touched by such a luxurious and high-profile way, but at the same time I feel sorry for you. These are not suitable for me. Please don't do it again. Ian paused in cutting the steak and looked up at her. He saw that Feng Ling only took a sip of red wine after speaking and had no intention of eating. Vincent said something about you, but he clearly doesn't know much. Ian put down the knife and fork in his hand, picked up a wet towel and wiped his hands. Do you mind telling me about your past? Feng Ling curved her lips. There's nothing to say. If you're unwilling to tell me, it means that you don't intend to open your heart to me. Ian looked at her with emotion. What kind of method do I have to use to pry open your heart? How can I see what's in your world? How can a girl like you reject me so completely? Even if you're playing hard to get, you've never done it before. Feng Ling smiled lightly and took another sip of red wine. After all, this was the rooftop. It was autumn and the wind seemed to be blowing. She didn't know where the wind came from, but the hair behind her shoulders was somewhat messy and tangled around her neck. I want to talk about, the warm wind isn't as deep as your love, with more like-minded people. Talk about life, find a bosom friend. Chapter 1290. I heard from Miss G that your alcohol tolerance isn't very good, Ian reminded her softly when he saw that she was only drinking. Feng Ling curved her lips lightly. It's just a glass of red wine. It's fine. I definitely won't drink any more. Feng Ling had been in England for a year and had always been well behaved. She couldn't say that she didn't drink at all, but at least she had never drunk too much. Even in some business meetings, even when she had to drink with others, she had always remembered her alcohol tolerance and never lost her composure. It was said that the more sober one was, the less one could immerse oneself in one's senses. Feng Ling had been knocked by fate to the point that she had no choice but to be too sober. She had even come to England in this state, so she had to keep herself on the edge of rationality at all times. She could not slack off at all. The rooftop was very quiet. Feng Ling did not speak much. Throughout the entire process, Ian would occasionally talk about what he had seen recently. Feng Ling would occasionally be silent and smile politely, but it was clear that she was just being polite. She didn't like him. It was obvious that she didn't like him. In the end, Ian put down the cutlery in his hand. If it doesn't suit your taste, shall I take you somewhere else to eat? No, I'm just not too hungry, Feng Ling said softly. Feng Ling said softly, Mr. Ian, I'm about to leave England. If there's no reason, I won't have the chance to come here again. Let's stop here. I don't want to affect my current peaceful and stable life. Ian knew that no matter how hard or soft he tried, he couldn't shake her. He smiled. All right, then this meal will be a farewell for you. I wish you a smooth journey back to America and I wish you a bright future. Feng Ling smiled. I don't deserve it. For a beginner in the business world like me, it's already a blessing to be able to negotiate a few deals. In this circle, it's already good enough that I can leave an intact corpse. How would I dare to think about a bright future? Although she said that, she still picked up the wine glass and clinked it with him, drinking the last mouthful of red wine in the glass. Perhaps it was because Mr. Ian really did not mention anything about pursuing her. Instead, from the perspective of a friend, he was purely concerned about the various problems she would have to take over the family business after returning to America. From time to time, he would remind her of some important things that she needed to pay attention to. Feng Ling's mood relaxed a lot. She picked up the cutlery and began to eat. As she ate, she chatted and laughed with him. The atmosphere was much more harmonious. After chatting for a while, he looked at Feng Ling's smiling face. I've known you for so long, but this is the first time I've seen you smile at me. Really? The smile on Feng Ling's face did not disappear. She naturally curved her lips. Xiaoba often complains that I don't like to smile and that I'm not approachable enough. It seems like it's true. It's okay. There are benefits to not smiling. At the very least, when you go back to take charge of your family's business at such a young age, the old foxes in the company will know that you're not a girl to be trifled with. They won't be able to easily see through your thoughts from your expression. This is also a good thing for you. Feng Ling only smiled lightly and did not reply. She was about to fork a piece of broccoli on the plate in front of her when she suddenly felt a faint pain on the back of her neck. In a slightly relaxed environment, she instinctively hissed and raised her hand to touch her neck. "What's wrong?" Ian saw her movements. "I'm fine." Feng Ling put down her hand, picked up a piece of broccoli, and placed it on the plate in front of her. "Yesterday afternoon, when I was looking for something in the company's database, I was scratched by the lamp holder next to the information cabinet. It's just a superficial wound. It'll heal in less than 2 days. Just now I raised my hand too much and accidentally pulled it." Hearing this, Ian stood up and walked over. Without waiting for Feng Ling to react, he stepped forward and tugged her collar back. Sure enough, there was a wound about 2 to 3 centimeters long on the back of her neck that was connected to the carotid artery. It wasn't too serious, but it was obvious that she had bled a lot when she was scratched. She didn't disinfect the wound and probably just washed it with water. She didn't tell anyone that she was injured here. The wound was already red and swollen. He frowned. "You're such a good girl. Every time you're injured you say it's fine. You say it's just a superficial wound. Could it be that you've suffered a more serious injury? What do you mean by superficial wounds? Have you never seen yourself as a woman?" Feng Ling felt a little uncomfortable being looked at by a man at such a close distance. She shrank her neck slightly and was about to avoid him when Ian raised his hand to press her head. "Don't move. Let me take a look." "Feng Ling, it's all right. It'll scab in 2 days. There's no need to be so." However, Ian pressed her head with one hand to prevent her from moving. He picked up his phone with the other and dialed a number. He said into the phone, "Send a medicine box up. I need disinfectant cotton and some medicine to treat simple injuries." "Yes, send it up now." With that, he put down his phone and continued to lift Feng Ling's collar. He looked at her snow-white neck with only a small wound. "Don't move first. I'll help you disinfect it later." "There's really no need." Feng Ling was about to get up, but he pressed down on her shoulder. Ian was a domineering man to begin with. Seeing that she was injured, it was impossible for him to let her get up and leave so easily. The two of them went back and forth like this. When Feng Ling turned to look at him, Ian had just lowered his head to say something to her, but in an instant, their breaths were so close that she almost bumped into his lips. The man in front of her had a deep gaze. He looked at her face and at her lips. He pressed down on her head and was about to kiss her. All of a sudden, a loud gust of wind came from above the rooftop. The wind speed was so fast that the tablecloth by the table fluttered. Feng Ling also had good ears and felt that the sound was familiar. It was like the sound of a large helicopter propeller. She abruptly pushed Ian away. In the blink of an eye, she saw a black helicopter fly over. It hovered more than 10 meters above the rooftop for a minute before landing on the rooftop. When he landed, the rose petals that covered the rooftop were swept aside by the wind and scattered everywhere. It was a complete mess. Ian turned back to see the helicopter that had suddenly landed on the rooftop of the building and frowned. When Feng Ling saw the 11 logo on the helicopter, her gaze did not change at all. The cabin door opened at this moment, and Li Nanheng's tall figure walked out. He stepped on the roses on the ground that were about to be crushed by the wind and looked at the man and woman who were almost hugging each other. His cold gaze swept across the candles and red wine on the table, and his eyes instantly turned cold. He wanted to chat with more like-minded people about, "The warm wind is not as deep as your love. Talk about life, find a bosom friend." Chapter 1291. Ian only saw the man walking out of the helicopter. Looking at his eyes that could almost kill the enemy, he subconsciously protected Feng Ling with one hand and shielded her behind him. At this moment, about 10 members of 11 base in black uniforms suddenly walked out of the helicopter. After walking out, they quickly lined up neatly beside Li Nanheng. As the roses on the ground were too much of a hindrance, they crushed them with their feet and kicked them aside, destroying more of the roses on the ground. Ian only saw that these people seemed to have a gun neatly attached to their waists. The man who appeared first was already looking at Ian's face. "Who are you?" Ian's expression was very unhappy. "Is the rooftop of the London International Bank building a place for you to park your plane?" Li Nanheng sneered, and at the same time, frost condensed in his cold brows. He did not answer him but turned his gaze to Feng Ling, who was behind the man. "Do you need me to explain to him, Miss Feng?" Feng Ling, who was about to speak, turned into Miss Feng, who gritted her teeth. At this moment, Feng Ling, who was never used to being protected, actually stayed behind him safely and did not even show her head. Earlier, if he was not mistaken, this man seemed to be touching her neck and wanting to kiss her. Fortunately, Li Nanheng had left the base. Even if he could mobilize his men, he could not carry a gun with him without permission. Otherwise he would have shot this grandson. From his words, he was here for Feng Ling. Ian turned to look at Feng Ling behind him. Feng Ling didn't expect Li Nanheng to suddenly appear here. Although she didn't want to see him, she couldn't drag Mr. Ian into this. She nodded apologetically to Mr. Ian. I'm sorry, they're here for me. Who are these people? Ian felt that their background was not small, especially since this group of people could openly and legally hold guns. They were definitely not small characters. 11 base in Los Angeles, United States. Have you heard of it? Feng Ling said in a low voice, the only private military base under the United Nations that is legal in the world. The one that has made great achievements in dealing with terrorists for several years. Ian said, I've heard of it, but I don't have much contact with such convenient personnel. I don't know much about it. You don't have to understand. I have nothing to do with them now. But Mr. Ian, I suggest you don't interfere in this matter. These people are not to be trifled with. Don't bring trouble to yourself. It was obvious that Ian was not worried about himself, but her. I'm fine, they won't do anything to me. Feng Ling didn't want to mention that she used to be a member of 11 base. After all, she was no longer a member of 11 base. Saying that would only make her unhappy. Seeing that Feng Ling and the man who was not afraid of death were still whispering to each other, Li Nanheng said coldly, Do you need me to call someone to drive the plane away and let the two of you continue chatting? Xiao Su came out of the cabin and quickly walked behind Li Nanheng. He looked in Feng Ling's direction and thought, Little ancestor, come over quickly. Don't provoke boss again. Boss Li hasn't slept for almost 2 days. He almost drove the plane over. If you provoke him again, boss will really kill you. Xiao Su walked out of the cabin and walked behind Li Nanheng quickly. These people are coming aggressively. Are you sure you don't need to call the police? Ian asked. Feng Ling shook her head. No, there's just some problems that need to be resolved. Seeing that she didn't seem to be affected or afraid, Ian relaxed. All right, I'll stay here with you. Seeing that the two of them were standing so close to each other and that the man still kept his hand on Feng Ling's head, Li Nanheng's cold eyes were as cold as frost and almost shot out ice shards. It's a personal question. Mr. Ian, please avoid it, Feng Ling said softly. Ian looked at her and felt a little defeated. Personal question. She had never treated him as one of her own. This Feng Ling had always been very clear about who was close and who was close. He sighed and patted her shoulder. All right, I'll wait downstairs. If there's any problem, shout. I'll come over with the security guards immediately. Feng Ling turned to look at the helicopter, the members of 11 base and Li Nanheng. She thought that even if something really happened, she wouldn't even have time to shout. She nodded. All right. Ian then left. Before leaving the rooftop, he glanced at Li Nanheng again. The man was expressionless, but the deterrent force around him was very strong. It was clear that he was not an ordinary person. 11 base? What did Feng Ling have to do with them? On the rooftop it was silent. Feng Ling remained sitting by the dining table without moving. Li Nanheng looked at her from a distance and then coldly glanced at the messy roses around him. He sneered. Not bad. Very romantic. Feng Ling's face was dark and she did not speak. Li Nanheng stepped on the roses on the ground and walked over. When he was in front of her, he lowered his eyes and looked down at her. Did you come to England to study or to fall in love? The career plan that grandfather Feng made for you doesn't seem to include you bringing back another son-in-law. Feng Ling didn't want to talk to him at all. If it weren't for Mr. Ian's face, she would have stood up and left. Right now, she was restraining herself to prevent Li Nanheng from blaming Mr. Ian. What are you doing here? She had nothing to say, but she had to say it. She only asked coldly. To bring you back to America. The man saw that she was smiling patiently at Ian earlier, but now she was not patient at all with him. His expression instantly darkened, and a shadow covered the side of his face. Do you think I'm here to watch you kiss other men? Feng Ling was angered by this man's matter-of-fact attitude. First of all, I'm going back to the United States. I'll book a plane ticket myself. Even if I go back, I'll go back to New York, not Los Angeles. I'm not on the same path as you. Besides, it has nothing to do with you. Aren't you being too nosy? This is the International Building of the Bank of London, not the empty square of your 11 base. Please have some sense of propriety. Don't think that the entire world is under your Li family's feet. Li Nanheng was speechless. Don't you think that the entire world is under your Li family's feet? Seeing that she knew how to talk back, Li Nanheng did not say anything. He only said coldly to Xiao Su, "Has she packed her things?" Chapter 1292. Xiao Su replied cautiously from behind, "And I've already asked someone to pack up. All the luggage is here and the passport and other things have been found." "What things? Whose luggage? Whose passport? What?" Feng Ling's eyelids twitched. "Yours." Li Nanheng glanced at her indifferently and turned to leave. Seeing that he was about to return to the helicopter, Feng Ling gritted her teeth and abruptly stood up to follow him. "Why are you touching my things? Li Nanheng, do you still have any respect for the law? How can you touch my things? Don't you know what respect is?" The man didn't even look back. When he reached the cabin door, he coldly said without looking back, "If I didn't respect you enough, I wouldn't have let you hide from me in England for a whole year. Now that your study in England has ended, there's no need to delay. I'll take you back to the United States. Is there a problem?" With that he went in. Feng Ling stood on the rooftop and didn't move, just looking at the helicopter. Xiao Su looked at the situation and felt that Boss Li was not easy to deal with. Otherwise he wouldn't have returned to 11 base overnight to mobilize a helicopter to kill his way here. As soon as he came, he saw Feng Ling and another man having a candlelight dinner on the rooftop and roses all over the ground, and it seemed that they were really intimate. Boss had really tolerated it. Otherwise he definitely wouldn't have let that person off so easily. Boss was still giving Feng Ling face. He had already endured enough. He walked over and leaned close to Feng Ling to say softly, "Go back with us first. Anyway, you're going back to the United States soon. We'll explain to Miss G later. If she knows that you were taken away by Boss Li, she won't be dissatisfied. Don't worry, we've brought all the things you should bring. We're just taking you back to the United States." Feng Ling turned to look at Xiao Su and noticed that he was not wearing a uniform. The members of 11 base were wearing uniforms, but Li Nanheng and Xiao Su weren't. In her memory, Xiao Su had never worn any other clothes. She only knew that Li Nanheng had gone back to take over the Li Corporation, but she didn't know that Li Nanheng had also left 11 base. She looked up and down coldly for a while and said with no emotion in her eyes, "I'm no longer a member of 11 base. You should know that your helicopter is not for an ordinary person like me. If you want to help me bring back other things, you can take them back. Please give me my passport. I'll fly back myself." "Oh, little ancestor, don't make trouble. Boss Li is not a member of 11 base now, but he can still mobilize the members and helicopters of the base. Don't be angry. Come back with us, Xiao Su sighed. Feng Ling's eyelids twitched. She abruptly turned to look at him. "What did you say?" Xiao Su paused. "I mean, Boss Li is not a member of 11 base now. After you left, he also resigned from the management position in 11 base. He can't go back like you." Feng Ling looked at Xiao Su for a while and did not speak. "Boss has never given up on you. He knows everything about you in England. He also knows that you have been angry with him, so he didn't come to look for you and let you study here peacefully. In fact, Boss is suffering more than anyone else." Xiao Su sighed. This time, Boss suddenly returned to the base to mobilize the helicopter. He has to come over as soon as possible. Feng is in charge of the base now. The helicopter can be mobilized, but Boss can't legally hold a gun now, so he has to send a few members to follow him to prevent anything from going wrong. For you, Boss has risked his life again and again. He can't carry any weapons on him, but he took the risk to drive the base's plane here. This time, he hasn't slept for almost 2 days, but as soon as he arrived, he saw you. Feng Ling glanced at him coldly, and Feng immediately shut his mouth. Then he looked at her with a gaze that could only be understood but not expressed in words, meaning that she should at least obediently get on the plane now. In order to stop things from getting out of hand, she should quickly follow him back to the United States. Seeing that Feng Ling still did not move, Xiao Su simply reached out to pull her arm. "Feng Ling, Miss Feng, little ancestor Feng, baby Feng, I know you and Boss have been in a cold war for a long time. Both of you have bad tempers, but can you?" Feng Ling wanted to say that it was not a cold war but a breakup. But before she could speak, Xiao Su had already dragged her to the cabin door. Feng Ling turned around and noticed that the members of 11 base who came with her were all unfamiliar faces. It was probably because Li Nanheng didn't want her to be too embarrassed, so he didn't mobilize any acquaintances. The only acquaintance who came with her was Xiao Su, who knew everything about her. She was silent for a moment and was brought onto the plane by Xiao Su. This plane was very big. It was even bigger than the helicopter she had taken on missions in the past. The space inside was also very spacious. After more than 10 people entered, it didn't feel crowded at all. The main reason was that those people were very restrained in front of the former boss and the former outstanding sniper of the base. All of them sat upright and did not say a word. Facing this atmosphere, Feng Ling was a little helpless. She then saw that Li Nanheng seemed to have not slept for 2 days. Right now he was standing in the cabin rubbing his brows with one hand, his entire body filled with irritation and displeasure. She looked at the destroyed roses outside and glanced at Mr. Ian, who was walking up the stairs. Seeing her board the plane, the two of them looked at each other through the cabin door. Feng Ling sighed. Fortunately, she had never been merciful. Otherwise she would have owed him a debt of love. She gave him an apologetic look. Ian picked up his phone, pointed at it and then at her, asking if it was convenient for her to answer the phone now. Feng Ling shook her head. Since she was leaving England, the relationship that should be ended should be ended. The relationship that had never been started should not be started. This was good for everyone. The plane gradually rose. Li Nanheng put down his hand and turned back to see that Feng Ling was still looking at the man reluctantly. He frowned and said, "Should I send you down to say goodbye to him?" Feng Ling ignored him, but her gaze had already left the rooftop. She silently looked at the gradually rising position outside. Her gaze was flat, and her voice was emotionless. "Since Mr. Li insists on being the good person who sends me back to America, please send me back to New York." Li Nanheng turned around and walked over. He glanced at her and was about to say something when he suddenly saw a red mark on the back of her neck. He narrowed his eyes. "How did you get hurt?" Feng Ling subconsciously raised her hand to cover her neck and did not answer. "Don't block it. Let me see." Li Nanheng frowned coldly and reached out to pull her hand down. Chapter 1293. Feng Ling turned her body to avoid his hand. Her eyes were indifferent. "It's just a small wound accidentally scratched on the lampstand. Mr. Li, you don't have to worry about it. You just need to send me back to New York." Li Nanheng paused and his hand hovered in the air. He looked at her for a moment but did not put his hand down. Instead, he suddenly grabbed her shoulder and pressed her down on the sofa closest to the cabin door. When Feng Ling was about to break free, he pressed her legs down and pressed her shoulders to prevent her from moving. At the same time, he turned back and coldly ordered the 10 base members behind him, "Turn around. Without my order, don't turn back." "Yes." The 10 base members, who were already very embarrassed, quickly turned around. "What are you doing?" Feng Ling was alarmed by the man's words and actions. She struggled hard, but was still firmly held down by the man's pair of iron-like hands. Then her collar was quickly flipped open, and the wound, which was not too serious but was still very red, was completely exposed to the man. "Why are you like this?" The man took a look and confirmed that what she said was true, but he still placed his hand on her neck and stroked the slightly red part of her wound. "When we get there, disinfect it first." "There's no need." If it weren't for his sudden appearance, her neck would have been disinfected by Mr. Ian. Feng Ling was too lazy to speak. She pushed him impatiently again. "Take your hand away." Not only did Li Nanheng not move his hand away, but he also took the opportunity to press her against the sofa. His gaze shifted from her neck to her face. The little woman, who was restrained and pressed against the sofa, had grown a lot of hair. It had already grown past her shoulders. Due to her struggling movements, the soft strands of hair wrapped around her neck. The clear contrast between her black and white hair and the skin on her neck formed a stark contrast. In particular, she used to only wear sportswear. Now, she was wearing a professional outfit that resembled a female office lady. Although it wasn't a dress, it was still quite feminine. However, despite her obvious change in appearance, her eyes were still as cold as ever. The more she struggled, the harder the man pressed her down. The more she moved, the more he could not control his reaction. It couldn't be helped. It had been too long since he last saw her, and it had been too long since he last touched her. But right now, if she were to forcefully kiss him, Feng Ling would probably explode in anger. Li Nanheng's eyes flashed with annoyance because she was moving under him, and he ordered, "Change the route to Los Angeles." Feng Ling immediately stopped struggling. "You promised to send me back to New York. Why are you bringing me to Los Angeles? If you dare to move again, not only will I take you back to Los Angeles, but I will also skin you right here." The man lowered his head and whispered hoarsely in a voice that only she could hear, "You know, I, Li Nanheng, can do what I say." Xiao Su and the others in the cabin had already turned their backs, but that didn't mean they couldn't hear what was going on behind them. Feng Ling was so angry that her face turned pale. She glared at him fiercely. When Li Nanheng saw that she was so angry that she subconsciously bit her lips, his eyes darkened. God knew how much restraint he needed to not kiss her. She no longer moved but gripped the leather of the sofa tightly with both hands. Her eyes were filled with anger and vaguely fierce. However, her expression, coupled with her feminine appearance, did not have the deterrence she used to have. Instead, she was like an angry little beast, making him want to hug her, stroke her head and stroke her fur. Li Nanheng really wanted to do this, but just as he was about to hug her, Feng Ling suddenly said, "I won't move. Don't touch me." The man who was about to reach down to hug her, paused for a moment and lowered his eyes to look at her. He did not speak. Feng Ling looked at him. "I won't move, I won't struggle, and I won't mess with you. Let go of me. When we reach New York, we'll part on good terms." Li Nanheng tightened his chin and said coldly, "Part on good terms?" Because of the man's tense voice, Feng Ling subconsciously felt that it was dangerous. She didn't move on the sofa and avoided his eyes. Seeing that she completely rejected him and didn't even want to talk to him, Li Nanheng's cold face darkened. However, Feng Ling's appearance of being pressed on the sofa made it impossible for him to continue like this. Otherwise, it was hard to say what he would do to her. After all, he had been abstinent for so long and had been a vegetarian for nearly 2 years. Even a monk might not be able to endure it. He let go of her and turned back to order Xiao Su, who was not far behind him. "Later, get someone to bring her luggage up and head back to Beauty Poo." "All right, the people we sent have already packed up. When we arrive at the agreed place, we'll stop for a while and move everything up." Li Nanheng's expression was still cold. He turned to look at Feng Ling, who was sitting on the sofa. He saw that she had buttoned her collar again and combed her long hair back. She frowned, looking dissatisfied with being on his helicopter. Helplessness flashed across Li Nanheng's deep eyes. He turned to walk toward her. Seeing him approach again, Feng Ling's entire body instantly raised her guard. She raised her head and looked at him warily. He did not approach her again and just looked at her. Feng Ling stared back at him coldly. The silent stalemate between the two of them made Xiao Su not even dare to breathe. At this moment, the helicopter began to land slowly. Because of the wind outside, the landing was a little bumpy and unstable. Feng Ling withdrew her gaze because of the bumpiness and no longer looked at him. She closed her eyes and patiently waited for the landing. After the helicopter landed, she was about to get up when Li Nanheng's voice rang. "Get someone to bring the things up. You don't have to go out and get them yourself." With her skills, once she left the cabin, she would definitely disappear without a trace. Even if he could catch up, it would definitely take some time. There was no need to waste time with her here. Seeing that this last chance to escape had been cut off by him, Feng Ling's hands clenched into fists in her sleeves. When she heard Li Nanheng deliberately say, "In case you accidentally get lost after getting off the plane, I'll have to waste time looking for you," she sneered angrily and turned her head disdainfully, too lazy to explain to him. When someone came over to bring Feng Ling's luggage up, several members of the base in the cabin rushed over to pick it up. In the past, Feng Ling did not have much luggage, but in the year she was in England, she was often dragged by Jin Wan and Xiao Ba to buy things. Especially clothes, which filled the entire wardrobe. As a result, her luggage was now packed into 2 large boxes. It's the end of the month, the old auntie is rolling on the ground, begging for monthly tickets, begging for monthly tickets, begging monthly tickets. Chapter 1294. However, Feng Ling was more concerned about her books, especially the various books that Mr. Zand had given her, as well as the many business case analyses that she had yet to finish reading. Seeing that her luggage was sent up, when the cabin door closed again, she suddenly got up and walked over. When she passed by Li Nanheng, she did not stop. She walked over expressionlessly, snatched her suitcase from the members of the base, and carried it to the side. Seeing that she was only going to tidy up her own things, no one dared to stop her. Feng Ling opened the suitcase. Sure enough, a group of straight men stuffed her things into the suitcase, but fortunately nothing was left behind. All the things she often used and important books were still there. She squatted there and tidied up the things inside one by one. After putting away the materials, she took out the other clothes inside. Looking at the clothes that were stuffed into the suitcase, Feng Ling glanced at Xiao Su in disdain. Xiao Su rubbed his nose awkwardly. "I'm sorry. When I sent people over to get your things, I only told them to pack your things as soon as possible. I forgot to tell them to put them away properly." Feng Ling was too lazy to speak. She just folded the clothes one by one. Li Nanheng stood by the side, looking at the dresses in her suitcase, and then at Feng Ling, who was squatting there and carefully tidying up her clothes. No matter how hurtful his decision to expel her from 11 base was, at least he finally pushed her back to the right track of her life. A good girl shouldn't risk her life in the base. All the unfairness and suffering that fate had brought her since she was a child should come to an end. She said that she only had 11 base because everything she had experienced in the past had been deeply rooted in her world. But as long as she uprooted those things, she could be reborn. Right now, Feng Ling was as carefree as she used to be. She no longer relied on the base. She could use her identity as the miss of the Feng family to take all the risks and walk out of this world peacefully. There are so many dresses. When are you going to put them on for me to see? The man saw her pick up another dress and fold it neatly. Feng Ling paused and lowered her eyes to look at the dresses in her suitcase. Most of them were forced by Jinwan and Xiaoba to force her to try them on and buy them. Many of them didn't even have the tags removed, and she didn't wear them much. She didn't say anything and continued to pack up her things with her head lowered. After packing everything up, she was sure that those bastards at least knew not to touch her underwear when they went to take her things. There was everything here except for her underwear, which meant that they really didn't dare to touch it. After all, she had received too much training back then. She wouldn't feel dizzy and numb from squatting for too long. However, the plane had just returned to a certain altitude when it suddenly jolted again. She had just stood up and hadn't stabilized her body when she suddenly swayed. Li Nanheng was about to help her, but she suddenly reached out to grab the back of the sofa in front of her, quickly avoided his outstretched hand and stood firmly. Li Nanheng watched her hold the sofa and still came forward to hold her. Sit down. It's windy today. The plane is not very stable. Feng Ling looked at his superfluous action, turned her eyes and looked at him coldly. Li Nanheng pretended not to see it and pressed her back to the sofa. At the same time, he glanced at the red mark on her neck and asked coldly, "Is there a medical kit in the cabin?" "Yes." Xiao Su nodded. When he heard Boss Li say that Feng Ling's neck was injured, he wanted to say it, but at that time the atmosphere was not right, so he didn't dare to speak rashly. "Bring it over." "All right." Xiao Su hurriedly went to find the first aid kit and handed it to Li Nanheng. He wanted to say that he would help Feng Ling with the wound, but then he saw that Feng Ling's wound was on her neck and she had to open her collar. Boss Li obviously had no intention of doing it for him, so he didn't say much. He eagerly opened the first aid kit and took out the easy-to-use disinfectant cotton and the wound. "Boss, I have all these things." Li Nanheng took the medical disinfectant cotton and picked it up with tweezers. He turned to look at Feng Ling sitting on the sofa and reached out to pull her collar open. Although it was not too big and only half of her collarbone was exposed, Xiao Su instinctively turned his back and waved his hand, signaling the other base members in the cabin to continue turning their backs. Feng Ling knew that she couldn't avoid it. Her eyes were a little impatient, but no matter how impatient she was, Li Nanheng still pressed the disinfectant cotton on the wound on her neck. She didn't feel much pain before, but now it suddenly hurt. She frowned and said coldly with an expressionless face, "Do you know how to do it? If you don't, I'll do it myself." With that, she raised her hand to snatch the thing from his hand. Li Nanheng avoided her hand without a trace and continued to help her clean the slightly red wound. At the same time he said lightly, "Don't you know whether I know how to do it or not? Haven't I helped you deal with your wounds many times?" Feng Ling didn't speak but turned her head and ignored him. Even if she ignored him like this, at least she was in front of him. It was much better than being separated from him and not being able to see each other. After Li Nanheng cleaned and disinfected her wound, he picked up the medicine powder and sprinkled it on her wound. This time, it didn't hurt very much because the man sprinkled the medicine powder very gently. Then he was about to help her apply the gauze when Feng Ling raised her hand to block his hand. "There's no need to apply it. It's not a deep wound." The gauze was indeed dispensable. It was enough to make sure that it wouldn't be infected after disinfection. Li Nanheng didn't insist. He put the gauze back and turned to wash his hands. Feng Ling moved her neck and adjusted her collar to cover the red wound that had just been treated. Her ears were filled with the sound of the propellers outside the helicopter cabin. No matter how fast they flew, it would still take a long time to fly back to New York. After Li Nanheng washed his hands and came out, he saw that Feng Ling had taken a coat and covered herself with it. She leaned against the sofa and looked like she was about to fall asleep. Now she had learned how to take care of herself. She knew how to accept when she couldn't resist, and she also knew how to use sleep to kill time. At the same time, she could avoid too much direct contact with him. Chapter 1295. Even though he knew that she wanted to avoid him by sleeping, Li Nanheng did not say anything. It was a good thing to rest more. After all, they still had to fly for a long time. Li Nanheng only glanced at her. Seeing that she was no longer moving with her eyes closed, he signaled Xiao Su and the others to sit on the other side. Li Nanheng walked over and sat down on another sofa beside Feng Ling. He turned to look at the woman who had fallen into a deep sleep, with her eyes closed. He looked at her coat and reached out to help her lift it. In the beginning, Feng Ling did not want to come into direct contact with him. She only wanted to avoid him by sleeping. But perhaps it was because red wine helped her sleep, especially good red wine. Even if it was just a cup, just a few sips, she still fell asleep after sitting quietly with her eyes closed for a while. The helicopter landed on a private helipad in the suburbs of New York. Several cars were already waiting outside. After the plane landed, the base members in the cabin quickly walked out. Xiao Su also glanced at Li Nanheng and Feng Ling before getting off the plane. Feng Ling was still sleeping, and Boss was still sitting by the side looking at her unhurriedly. He did not seem to be in a hurry to get off the plane. Boss, the air traffic control in New York is too strict. To avoid trouble, we landed here first. Drive her back to the Feng family. Should we send her back now or, there's no rush. Let's wait for her to wake up, Li Nanheng said mildly. He had already brought her back to America. Of course there was no rush. Whether it was New York or Los Angeles, they were all within his reach. It was no longer England. Seeing that Boss Li was reluctant to wake Feng Ling up, as expected, the well-tempered steel turned soft in front of Feng Ling. Xiao Su did not disturb him anymore and got off the plane. Feng Ling continued to sleep for a while. The sky outside was already bright. It was past 7 in the morning. Seeing that Feng Ling was still sleeping, Li Nanheng bent over and picked her up. His movements were very gentle, trying not to wake her up. When he carried her off the plane and was about to get into the car, Xiao Su walked over. Boss, let's go to the one in front. Let the brothers from the base drive the other cars away first. I'll go back to 11 base and inform them. Li Nanheng responded indifferently and continued to carry Feng Ling. Feng Ling was indeed asleep. If no one touched her, she would be in a deep sleep. However, no matter how steady Li Nanheng's embrace was, he moved from the sofa to another place. Xiao Su followed Li Nanheng and whispered, Boss, carry her to the back. I'll drive. It's okay, I'll drive. But if I leave her alone like this, I'm afraid I'll wake her up. She's awake. Xiao Su, Feng Ling. Feng Ling opened her eyes and looked at the man who had already seen through everything about her. Seeing that she opened her eyes, Li Nanheng wasn't surprised at all. He smiled and looked at her. You're finally willing to open your eyes? Feng Ling took advantage of the way the man carried her into the car and pushed him. She then sat at the back of the car, unwilling to sit with him. Seeing this atmosphere, Xiao Su felt that he shouldn't be an eyesore here, so he didn't follow in and turned to go to another car. Seeing that Feng Ling sat at the back, Li Nanheng didn't say anything. He opened the door of the front passenger seat and started the engine to drive away. This car was very big. He was in front and she was in the back. The two of them were quiet and didn't communicate much. It wasn't until they crossed a road and drove to New York that Li Nanheng said, Before you went to England, you should have known that you still have a grandmother. You've seen her before, but during that time she was ill for a long time and stayed in the hospital in a daze. Later, when she woke up and found out everything, she couldn't take the blow. For the past 2 years her health hasn't been good. She's living in a sanatorium in Los Angeles. You're in New York. If you have time in the future, go back to see her. Feng Ling did not speak. She had considered the matter of her grandmother before and asked her grandparents about it on the phone. She planned to bring her grandmother to New York to live after she returned to America. She didn't have much family love since she was young, but there were only a few relatives who treated her well. However, they all doted on her. She knew this, especially the jade pendant on her. It seemed that her grandmother had worn it for her. And she didn't have much to say about this matter and answered lightly. Feng Ling was very silent. This silence was different from the cautious and quiet silence she used to have in the base. She was a silence that completely isolated him. Li Nanheng drove and looked at her through the rearview mirror. What plans do you have after returning to New York? Feng Ling ignored him and lowered her head to look at her phone for a while. Xiao Ba sent a message asking her why she had disappeared. She was still considering how to answer that she had flown back to New York from London overnight. Jin Wan had probably already received the news and hadn't asked her anything yet. As for Xiao Ba, she was still hesitating on how to reply. Li Nanheng suddenly stopped the car by the side of the road. Feng Ling's finger was poking at the screen of her phone. Because he suddenly stopped the car, she looked up at him. The man looked at Feng Ling through the rearview mirror. Their eyes met. After looking at each other for a moment, he didn't say anything and continued driving forward. Feng Ling watched the man's back as he drove and was silent for a while. In the end, she didn't say anything. She had already said what she needed to say when he gave her the expulsion document of 11 base. Li Nanheng himself knew the decision he had made back then. The two of them were well aware of it, which was why he had not seen her for so long. The car was very quiet. The man drove and the woman lowered her head to look at her phone. In the rearview mirror, sunlight shone in through the slightly open window. She didn't have any makeup on her face, and her long eyelashes drooped slightly because she lowered her head, like an ink fan. Li Nanheng didn't know how much restraint he had used to not kidnap her back to Los Angeles but send her back to New York. He had chosen this path for her. He had taken the risk that she would be angry and break up with him to help her choose this path home and cut off the connection between her and 11 base. Right now, if he didn't send her back to New York but brought her back to Los Angeles, he really wasn't a human being. However, he was not rational. He didn't want to send her back to New York at all. Feng Ling, who had changed so much, was what he had expected. It was what he wanted to see, but now he was afraid to see. The distance that she had created between them was like a ditch that they might not have been able to cross during the 8 years of their grudges. She was trying very hard to avoid him. Even though she did not show any excessive anger, she was avoiding him at all times. Her avoidance was very obvious. Chapter 1296. The car was on the way back to the Feng family. Feng Ling had already taken a nap and was in a good state of mind. She turned to look at the other two cars. Most of the cars sent from 11 base looked no different from ordinary cars, but in fact, every car had the function of an armored car. Even if there was a terrorist attack, they could immediately find a weapon to deal with it. 11 base. Feng Ling's gaze became indifferent. She placed her hand on her lap and looked at Li Nanheng's figure indifferently. Just send me to the city. I'll take a taxi back myself. Li Nanheng did not respond. I have nothing to do with you. If you send me back like this, the Feng family will be suspicious. Li Nanheng replied coldly. Why? Are you afraid that they will be suspicious? I'm not afraid, but there's no need, Feng Ling said mildly. Feng Ling said lightly, after all, it's quite troublesome to be mentioned again and again for people who have no relationship with me. Li Nanheng suddenly braked the car. It was so sudden that Feng Ling was caught off guard. She staggered forward and then abruptly steadied herself and looked up at him. The man's expressionless face looked a little tense. It was clear that he was still angered by her. Feng Ling didn't care if he was angry or not. She just looked at him indifferently. However, the car that had just stopped quickly restarted the engine and abruptly drove toward the other side of the road. The base members in the two cars by the side watched as Boss's car suddenly turned and drove away. They were all stunned and turned to look at Xiao Su in the car. Xiao Su also didn't understand the situation. Didn't Boss say that he wouldn't do anything after returning to America and would directly send Feng Ling back to the Feng family safely? But why the hell did Boss suddenly change his route? Brother Su, should we follow him? Follow my ass. Didn't you see how fast Boss is driving? Xiao Su looked at the car that instantly sped away on the side road. Let's go to the intersection of the city according to the original plan. Boss, he should know what to do. Based on Boss's temper in the past, it was hard to say what would happen if he took Feng Ling away. But according to Xiao Su's observation in the past 2 years, he found that although Boss's temperament was the same as before, he always restrained himself when it came to Feng Ling. Although he was stubborn, he still couldn't beat Feng Ling. When two enemies met on a narrow path, the brave would win. Boss Li, this bloodthirsty tiger, could only be a tame tiger in front of Feng Ling. In the car, Feng Ling looked at the sudden change of route and frowned slightly. She turned to look at the road and scenery outside. Where are you taking me? The man didn't speak. He just drove with a cold face and stepped on the accelerator again and again. Feng Ling ignored the speed of the car. She had jumped out of the car in an emergency before. She raised her hand to open the door, only to find that the door was locked. She abruptly turned to look at the man driving the car and saw the coldness and displeasure in his back view. The air around him and even the air in the car seemed to tense up. Li Nanheng stopped the car. Feng Ling's heart skipped a beat. She frowned and said coldly. Not only did the car not stop because of her words, but it continued to drive forward at an extremely fast speed. Feng Ling couldn't open the car door, so she stepped forward to stop him from driving the car forward. However, the man held the steering wheel with one hand and held her wrist with the other. Without looking back, he said coldly, Sit back down. Stop the car. Feng Ling struggled. The man controlled the steering wheel with one hand and drove the car quickly and effortlessly. His other hand also held her tightly. Feng Ling struggled several times but was unable to pull her hand out. In the end she cried softly, "If you don't let go, my wrist is going to break." Only then did he loosen his grip and let go of her. Feng Ling quickly pulled her hand back and sat back on the seat. As she rubbed her wrist that was about to be broken by him, she watched the road and scenery quickly pass by. "Where are you taking me?" She was not very familiar with the roads in New York, unlike when she was in Los Angeles, where she had been to many places, big and small, and could guess most of them just by looking at the route. But now she had no idea where he was taking her. Of course, Li Nanhing did not answer her at all. Feng Ling looked over her shoulder at the dashboard in front of him. The car had already exceeded 260. This speed. Thankfully they had suddenly turned from the highway into a small road. The road was smooth but there were no cars or people around. The road was smooth. Feng Ling rubbed her wrist for a while and didn't say anything. She just sat there expressionlessly and watched Li Nanhing drive. She watched as the scenery on both sides of the road gradually became as though there was no road. Even if there was a road, it was only a very simple stone road. It was not smooth. Then she watched as the place gradually went uphill. In the blink of an eye, she saw that Li Nanhing had actually driven the car to Mount Nevada in the suburbs of New York. Mount Nevada was a high mountain more than 100 kilometers away from the edge of New York City. There were cliffs on it and there were beasts in the forest. This place was usually deserted. The black off-road vehicle ignored the potholes and stones on the mountain road and drove all the way up quickly. Because no one walked here all year round, the mountain road that could barely be seen was overgrown with weeds. If this car hadn't been modified and the driver wasn't Li Nanhing, it would have been difficult to drive smoothly on such a slope and mountain road. When the car drove halfway up the mountain because the slope was even steeper, it broke down once. Feng Ling took the opportunity to ask him to stop, but the man did not make a sound. He continued to start the engine, circled around the steepest and dangerous mountain road, and went to the other side to continue driving up. Half an hour later they arrived at the top of Mount Nevada. The black off-road vehicle stopped at the top of the mountain. The sky was already bright. At this time even the sunrise had been missed. However, the direction where the sun was shining was so dazzling that the solar film on the two car windows almost couldn't block it. Feng Ling rolled down the car window and looked at the rising sun in the distance. She narrowed her eyes and then looked at the scenery of the top of Mount Nevada. She saw the steep mountain road on one side and the steep cliff on the other. Feng Ling had lived in the jungle since she was young, so she was not afraid of this kind of place. She only looked outside before retracting her gaze. She looked at Li Nanhing, who had been silent all this time with a dark expression. After stopping the car, he got out of the car with a cigarette in his hand. Seeing the man light a cigarette after getting out of the car, Feng Ling did not move but glanced at the seat next to the steering wheel. She thought that if Li Nanhing dared to do anything to her here, she would drive the car away and leave him here to feed the beasts. Chapter 1297. The car key was not taken away. It could be seen that Li Nanhing had never been wary of her. Was he really not afraid that she would leave him in such a place? Feng Ling glanced at the man outside the car door and watched as he stood there smoking. She could vaguely feel the anger he was suppressing. From the speed at which he drove earlier, she could tell that he was having a hard time holding it in. He had allowed her to lose her temper and vent her cold war. He had been enduring it but he was still angry. Otherwise he wouldn't have suddenly driven here. He didn't want to vent his anger on her, so he would rather get out of the car and smoke silently. Feng Ling looked at the man who was in a rage. She felt that if she got out of the car now he could twist her head off at any time. She couldn't beat him. This was what she had known for so many years. She simply didn't provoke him and sat quietly in the car. She didn't know how many cigarettes the man had smoked outside. At this time the car window that she had just closed was knocked on. She turned to see the man standing outside the car door. His eyes were cold and heavy and he looked down at her. "Get out of the car." This was an order. There was no warmth in his tone. Feng Ling pushed the car door open and got out of the car. Before she could stand firm, Li Nanhing pressed her against the car door in front of her. Her back hit the car door hard. It was not painful but it was definitely not indifferent. As Li Nanhing pressed her down, he leaned over and looked into her eyes. "Feng Ling, do you really think I love you so much that I have no bottom line?" The man's mouth was filled with the strong smell of tobacco. Although it was not unpleasant because he had smoked too much, especially for someone like Feng Ling who had never smoked, such a strong smell of tobacco was a bit suffocating. Feng Ling saw that this man was like a restrained lion. It was only because it was her that he tried his best to restrain his sharp and fierce claws and teeth. Feng Ling's eyes were calm. Even though her shoulders were pressed by him and her body was imprisoned between his chest and the car door, she was still calm as though the person in front of her had nothing to do with her. Li Nanheng, since you insist on bringing me to such a desolate place, it means that you want to find a place where no one will disturb you to talk to me. Since you want to talk to me, can you let go of me first? Li Nanheng lowered his eyes to look at her. Instead of withdrawing his strength, he took a step forward and pressed her more firmly against the car door. Feng Ling's expression instantly darkened. Since you insist on using such a method, don't blame me for hurting you. Is there anything more ruthless than when you said that you would personally cut off the relationship between us? Hurling insults? Let me hear how you plan to hurt me. Li Nanheng narrowed his eyes at her. If it weren't for the fact that the atmosphere was not right, he really wanted to bite her lips hard, kiss her until she cried, and bite her until she kept struggling and crying under him. The man's eyes were dark and misty. Feng Ling looked straight into his eyes and said word by word, "From the beginning to the end of our relationship, which step didn't you hold my hand and take me away? From the very beginning when I was still disguised as a man, you forced me to submit to you. Even if you ignored the taboos between genders, you forced me to be with you. And then, when I repeatedly retreated, you forced your way into my life and tied me to your side. You tied me to your heart and couldn't get out. I can indeed see how well you treat me, and I admit that I really couldn't get out. Li Nanheng, you were the one who tied me into your heart. Later you cut off all my beliefs in the pillar behind me and pushed me away. What kind of attitude do you think I should have toward you now? It's not my character to cry and argue with you hysterically. Since you flew to England and brought me back, it's useless for me to argue with you. Since you decided to send me back to New York, it means that you've never regretted your decision to let me return to the Feng family. Since you chose this path for me, I have no choice or regret. What right do you have to take me away? What right do you have to question my attitude and your bottom line? If you really want to talk about a bottom line, Li Nanheng, have you considered that I have a bottom line too? What did I do to make your bottom line suddenly rise so much? Li Nanheng asked coldly. He pressed his hand on her shoulder, not allowing her to break free. He was taller than her by a head and imprisoned her. He said harshly, I let you go back to the Feng family to live a normal life and let you study in England for a year. Did I look for you? Which time did I not respect you? Which time? Feng Ling suddenly realized that she could not reason with this man who always said that he was very reasonable. She was not good at debating with others. After a year in the business world, she had indeed trained her tongue, but all her training was not used to quarrel with him after returning to America. The more she did not speak, the more she did not want to reason with him. She did not want to waste her breath with him, and the angrier Li Nanheng became. Looking at the indifferent expression in her eyes that she could not be bothered to argue with him, he recalled the mouthful of blood she had spat out by the flower bed downstairs. Every day he would see the blood stain when he passed by that place. Later, he didn't know which busybody in the property management department wiped the blood away, but he would often sit by the flower bed for an entire night. He tried his best not to look for the person he did not want to disturb. Now that he had finally brought her back from England, she did not even have the slightest intention of insisting on talking to him. She only avoided him again and again. Seeing that he was unwilling to let her go, Feng Ling closed her eyes and opened them again. Back then, when you gave me the expulsion document, you should have known that you cut off all my paths of retreat. I can no longer be the Feng Ling of the past. Even the Feng Ling who had been moved by you, who had liked and loved you, was cut off by you. A sharp glint flashed across Li Nanheng's eyes. He didn't give her a chance to continue her ruthless words. He pinched the back of her neck and lifted her up from the car door. He forcefully pressed a kiss on her lips, pried open her lips, and swallowed her breath without hesitation. Feng Ling's body tensed up in an instant. As soon as she raised her hands, he quickly held them and pressed them against the car door. In less than a minute, her lips were sore and numb from his kisses. His breathing became heavier and heavier, and he no longer restrained himself. He lifted her clothes and placed his hot palms on the skin of her waist, causing her to shiver all over. W. For M. Chapter 1298. Li Nanheng. Feng Ling couldn't break free and could only bite him in the end. However, the man seemed to be really angered by her words. He held her waist firmly and said hoarsely, "Do you mean that I've never respected you? In my life, I've only been careful with you, but you said that I'm the one who drove your emotions and I don't respect you? I don't care if you like me or not, do I have to tie you to my side? I'm the one in charge of everything. You're unwilling and you don't like it?" Li Nanheng took out his hand, abruptly pulled out his belt and tied Feng Ling's wrist behind her. As Feng Ling widened her eyes in disbelief, he tugged the belt hard, pulled it to the bottom and tied her wrist in an instant. The back door hadn't closed yet. The man held her waist with one hand and tugged at her clothes with the other. When Feng Ling trembled in anger and was about to bite him, he pressed her into the car. There was no gentleness in this kiss, nor was there any longing or care that he hadn't kissed her for a long time. Instead, with heat and anger, he nibbled on her lips and swallowed all her cries. The hot breath from the man's nose landed on her face. Feng Ling couldn't break free. Several times she wanted to scold him, but her lips and tongue were blocked by him. Because she struggled hard but couldn't do anything, her nose was bleeding and dense beads of sweat were on her nose. His kiss became more and more forceful, as though he was going to suck her into a vortex. After kissing for a full 10 minutes, her clothes were removed. As the sun shone brightly outside, the temperature in the car was boiling. Feng Ling's face was crimson. Her oxygen was about to be exhausted, and her brain was buzzing. Li Nanheng's kiss deepened, as though he was tempting her to go crazy with him. Feng Ling was so angry that she lost her rationality. She didn't know when he would stop. If he continued kissing her, she would really die. Especially the fact that her wrists were tied by the belt, it caused countless resentment to burst out of her chest. She kept biting him and in an instant, their lips were covered with wounds. Of course, he had the most and her lips were red and swollen from the kiss. Li Nanheng. Stop. Ugh. The man easily picked her up and let her sit on his lap. She could feel his strong muscles in this position. Even though he hadn't been in the base for many days, even though he wasn't used to training every day, this man's body was still shockingly strong. "Don't go too far." Feng Ling panted and said with some difficulty as she suddenly sat up. Li Nanheng held her waist and looked at her coldly. "Do you know what real disrespect is? I'm afraid you don't even know what it's like to seize something by force." Feng Ling's eyelids twitched. She stared at him. "What are you doing?" "I'm warning you, don't." Before she could finish speaking, Li Nanheng had already held her waist and pulled her in front of him. Almost all the clothes on her body were removed, leaving only the thin and pitiful underwear. It rubbed against his pants. She could clearly feel the texture of his pants. It stimulated her whole body and made her tremble. Her whole body tensed up. The man's eyes were merciless and cold. He pinched her chin and forced her to come close to him. His deep eyes looked at her lips that had been kissed red and swollen. "If I don't let you experience it once, I'll be too wronged." Seeing the determination in the man's eyes, Feng Ling's heart skipped a beat. She subconsciously felt that he was going to be ruthless to her and quickly tried to get up from him. However, her hands were tied and her legs were separated. She anxiously tried to use the strength in her legs to get up, but no matter what, she could not defeat his strength. The man firmly held her down and kept her in this position against his legs. Outside the car window there was a cliff on the top of the mountain. The surroundings were desolate. It was as though he had returned to the half a year in the jungle of Malibu Beach. No one disturbed him and he could do whatever he wanted. But at least at that time, Li Nanheng was patient and gentle. Every night after showering he would hug and kiss her seductively. It was not like now, where the temperature in his eyes was so cold that Feng Ling was unable to resist. The more he pressed against his thigh, the more Feng Ling wanted to hide. In the end, because she was touched, even the tips of her toes were curled up. The corners of her eyes were slightly red as she looked at the man in front of her. The Li Nanheng in the past, no matter how domineering he was, at least, he wasn't like this. At this moment Feng Ling regretted it. She wanted to explain the topic of respect and disrespect, but the man did not give her a chance. He held her waist with one hand and unbuttoned his pants with the other. Hearing the movement of the man's zipper, Feng Ling shivered. Her curled toes immediately loosened and she rushed to get up. However, the man suddenly held her waist and pressed her against the seat behind the car. There was a lot of space behind the off-road vehicle, but Feng Ling had never thought that one day in the car he suddenly lowered his waist, showing no mercy. Feng Ling. Her mind was blank. Unprepared, she was in so much pain that she did not even have the strength to cry out. She subconsciously turned her head and bit his arm. At this moment, Li Nanheng also bent down to bite her ear. Before she could adapt, he began to move. At the same time, he said ambiguously and hoarsely in her ear, "Do you want to know what disrespect is? I'll let you experience it one by one. What is respect?" When they drove up the mountain, it was still morning and the sun was rising. When all the madness, passion, crying and fighting stopped, the sun had already set. Feng Ling was in a sorry state. Her long hair was wrapped around her sweaty neck, and the marks on her body were heavier than before. One look was enough to make her blush and her heart beat faster. Her legs were so weak that she could not even sit properly. She leaned weakly against the car seat, and there was only a man's coat covering her body. She gripped the coat tightly to cover her body, and her reddened eyes were filled with confusion. Her fingers gripped the coat too hard, and the knuckles between her fingers were pale. There were no cleaning measures in the car. Her clothes were torn and messy inside and outside the car. Li Nanheng's shirt was also messy from her grip. He simply put on his clothes and got out of the car. He knew how frightened and messy the little woman in the car was at this moment. At this moment, the last bit of reason in his mind finally returned. He could not face Feng Ling, who he had held in the palm of his hand for so many years, but in the end, in a rage, he pressed her against the car and bullied her. W. For M. Chapter 1299. Li Nanheng lit a cigarette outside the car and did not come in again. He couldn't face it. He bullied her in the car for several hours, listening to her cry until her throat was hoarse, listening to her bite his arm and constantly shouting, "Li Nanheng, stop. Li Nanheng, I hurt. Li Nanheng, I hate you. Stop for me." But he still couldn't stop. When he finally regained his senses, he saw the disheveled woman lying on the ground weakly with a blank look in her eyes. Looking at her bloodshot eyes, it was as if his brain had suddenly been struck by a bolt from the blue. He finally woke up from the shock. What was he doing? Li Nanheng held half a cigarette in his mouth and looked back at the closed car door. Even though he couldn't see anything through the window, he knew that she was still curled up inside and couldn't move. He knew how ruthless he was today. Ever since Feng Ling returned to the Feng family for nearly a year and then went to England for so long, she hadn't done it again for a long time. In the end, she was suddenly bullied by him in the car without any preparation. Not to mention Feng Ling's temper. Even Li Nanheng himself deeply doubted whether he could forgive himself. He was just angered by her words. Did he really have to use such a disrespectful method to make her feel the difference? Wasn't this digging a pit for himself to jump into? All the kindness he had shown her in the past had probably become negative now. In the end, the cigarette butt was too short. As if burned by the cigarette butt, Li Nanheng took the cigarette down and looked at the car door behind him. He first went to the front passenger seat to find a pack of wet wipes that had been thrown there at some point. Then he returned to the back door and was about to hand him the wet wipes when he entered the car. However, the moment he entered the car and approached, Feng Ling, who had been leaning against the seat motionlessly, suddenly trembled and shrank back. Seeing the trace of fear in her eyes, Li Nanheng's hand that was holding the wet towel froze. It was true. He bullied her too much. She was actually afraid of him. Li Nanheng simply pulled out the wet wipes and stepped forward to lift her coat to help her clean up. However, the moment he reached out, Feng Ling suddenly raised her red eyes and glared at him. "Get out." Her voice was so hoarse that it was almost inaudible. She tugged the coat back hard and covered her messy body. Li Nanheng did not speak, nor did he snatch the clothes she was using to cover herself. He simply helped her wipe her exposed legs. At the same time, Feng Ling quickly curled up her legs and said hoarsely and angrily, "Get lost." Seeing that he still refused to leave and insisted on wiping her body, Feng Ling gathered all the strength she could muster and abruptly raised her hand to slap him hard on the face. But the slap did not make Li Nanheng's face pale. Instead, he felt more comfortable. He looked at her and said softly, "Now do you know what it means to be disrespectful?" He looked at her and said in a low voice, "Nanheng's Feng Nanheng Feng Ling Feng 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 Nanheng and Feng. Do you need to prove it with your own actions?" Feng Ling's eyes were still red. She glared at him. "Li Nanheng, I can't wait for you to jump off the cliff. I can't wait for you to jump off the cliff." The man pursed his lips and looked at her silently for a moment. Then he placed the wet wipes by her hand. "If you really want to see me jump, okay, I'll jump." Feng Ling was speechless. She was so angry that her chest hurt even more. She suddenly turned her eyes away and closed them without speaking, but tears fell from the corners of her eyes. She was really crying. Because of the pain, because of the scenes that happened in the past few hours, because of the humiliation, and because she didn't dare to ask him to jump, she hated herself for being soft-hearted. But if she really asked him to jump, she knew he would definitely jump. Even if the result was just because of her momentary anger. How could he treat her like this? He might as well die. Feng Ling gritted her teeth and clenched the coat tightly. But what made her even more humiliated was that even the coat was his. Her own clothes, both inside and outside, were in tatters. Li Nanheng watched her cry and reached out to carry her over. However, Feng Ling turned her head and bit hard on his wrist. Just now, she had bitten him many times and his arm was already covered with bite marks, but he carried her over as if he couldn't feel the pain. Feng Ling raised her head and said angrily, "Don't touch me." He paused and looked down at her like a wounded beast. Feng Ling's voice trembled with hatred. "I'm in great pain. Don't touch me. Let me be alone for a while." He had heard her say that it hurt more than once. Li Nanheng looked down at her curled legs. "I'll take you to the hospital." "No need." Feng Ling covered her body with the large coat and tried to curl up her legs to cover them. She might as well jump off a cliff instead of going to the hospital for this kind of thing. However, although Li Nanheng didn't touch her again, he couldn't let her continue to hurt like this. He was indeed too ruthless at that time. He knew that she was in pain, but he didn't restrain himself. He went to the trunk and found a thin blanket for her. Feng Ling took the blanket and covered herself with it. She did not speak. Even if she didn't go to the doctor, she had to at least apply medicine. Otherwise, she would have a hard time these days. Seeing that she seemed to have a sense of security wrapped in the blanket, Li Nanheng returned to the driver's seat to drive. Feng Ling knew that he was going to drive down the mountain. She closed her eyes and leaned against the back without speaking. The mountain road was rugged. Even if they drove up smoothly, it was very difficult to go down the mountain. With Li Nanheng's driving skills, it was easy to stabilize the car and not roll down. However, the car swayed, making Feng Ling, who was not in a good condition, very uncomfortable. She frowned and clutched the blanket on her body with a pale face. She curled up in the back seat and couldn't even make a sound. They finally drove down the mountain and arrived at the intersection of New York City according to the original route. Xiao Su and the others' car was still there. They had been waiting anxiously. When they saw Boss Li's car finally coming, they were relieved. Li Nanheng looked at Feng Ling through the rearview mirror. After going down the mountain, the road was more stable and she was no longer in so much pain. However, she still clutched the blanket tightly and looked up at him through the rearview mirror. Her eyes seemed to be able to burn 2 holes in his back and seemed to be warning him. If he dared to let others see her like this, she would never forgive him in this life. Li Nanheng rolled down the car window and asked Xiao Su and the others to wait at the Feng family's home first. He then drove to find a nearby shopping mall. He had to buy a set of clothes for her first. Chapter 1300. After buying clothes and medicine, Li Nanheng parked the car near the shopping mall and quickly went to buy everything he needed. When he returned, he saw that Feng Ling was still curled up there with her eyes closed as though she had fallen asleep. Li Nanheng stepped forward to help her over. He wanted to help her put medicine on her lower body before helping her change her clothes. After all, there might really be some lacerations down there. However, as soon as he helped her over, Feng Ling's head drooped weakly to his side. Li Nanheng paused and lowered his eyes to look at the person in his arms. The touch of his hand was unbelievably hot. He frowned and raised his hand to touch her forehead, neck and back. It was very hot. Feng Ling, Li Nanheng quickly wrapped her up tightly with a thin blanket. "Don't sleep. You have a fever." Feng Ling frowned slightly but could not open her eyes. However, she was still conscious in her heart. Ever since she returned to the Feng family, her stomach had bled and she had a high fever after 2 days of freezing rain. Although her body had recovered later, it was very easy for her to have a fever. Once there was any inflammation or cold, she would have a fever, and the fever was very severe. Jin Wan had said that this kind of phenomenon often occurred in medicine. It was the sequela of severe physical exhaustion. She would occasionally have this kind of situation. Usually there was nothing wrong with her, but she was especially prone to a fever. As long as she had a fever, she would be in a daze until the fever subsided. In the year that Feng Ling was in England, she only fell ill once, and it was because the weather in London was wet and cold. That time she went out early in the morning to do something and wore too little. When she got out of the car, it happened to be raining. She caught a cold and was drenched by the rain. After returning, she had a high fever for a day and a night. At that time, it was said that she was in a daze from the fever. Xiaoba had been staying at her house to take care of her. When she woke up the next day, Xiaoba said that she had a fever the night before. It was really scary. She didn't know if her fever was serious or not, but her eyelids were so heavy that she couldn't open them. Even though she knew who was hugging her and knew that she had to leave this bastard's car as soon as possible, she couldn't open her eyes. He didn't even need to think to guess that it was probably because he had injured her lower body. It was already difficult to talk about the injury, and now she had a fever. Li Nanheng saw that Feng Ling frowned slightly and knew that she was unwilling to go to the hospital. Although her body temperature was high, it was not too shocking. He simply wrapped her in a thin blanket with his coat, picked up the medicine and clothes, and carried her out of the car. There was a hotel behind. Without saying a word, Li Nanheng carried her into the hotel, booked a room, and placed her on the bed. After lying on the bed, Feng Ling seemed to be more comfortable than in the car, but she still frowned slightly and curled up in the thin blanket. She didn't know how long she was half asleep and half unconscious. Suddenly, she felt as though her body had entered a warm pool. Feng Ling's consciousness could not recover. She only felt as though she was being supported to sit in the bathtub. The warm water surrounded her and made her feel much more comfortable. Her body was gradually cleaned and refreshed. Li Nanheng let Feng Ling sit in the water. After patiently washing her by the bathtub, he wrapped her in a bath towel and carried her out. To prevent her fever from worsening, he placed her in his arms and took the hairdryer to dry her shoulder-length hair. After confirming that her hair was no longer wet, he placed her back on the bed. Her temperature was still very high. He called the hotel staff to buy antipyretic medicine and fed it to her. After drinking the medicine, she fell asleep again. He had to wait for her to sweat and her fever to subside, so he couldn't put on clothes for the time being and could only let her lie in the blanket. In her dreams there were all kinds of people. It was what she had seen and heard in England. Feng Ling kept shuttling through the crowd in her dreams. She didn't know if she was looking for something or hiding from something. She just kept walking. When she suddenly bumped into a man's arms, she raised her eyes and saw Li Nanheng's face. Looking at that face, she couldn't remember what had happened. She only saw that the face in front of her eyes became clearer and clearer. It was so clear that her heart trembled. She turned to hide, but this man's face seemed to be everywhere in front of her. She was so angry that she kept running in the crowd, but no matter how far she ran, he was still there. The ghost lingered. In the end, Feng Ling was so angry that she suddenly took out a sniper rifle from her waist and kept shooting at the dozens of identical faces in front of her. Seeing that the faces were pierced by the bullets and exploded, she put down the gun and continued walking. However, as she walked, the faces that she had smashed gathered again and floated in front of her eyes. She was so angry that she raised her gun again and fired again, but the more bullets she fired, the more that bastard Li Nanheng's face gathered in front of her. In fact, this face gradually gathered and turned into a human figure. The scene in front of her suddenly turned into that mountain, and then an off-road vehicle suddenly appeared in front of her. The gun in her hand silently melted. She was pushed into the car by the man who had transformed into her, and her clothes were torn apart. Feng Ling was so shocked that her hair stood on end. For a moment she couldn't tell if it was a dream or reality. She instinctively kicked hard with her legs. However, with this kick, there seemed to be a hand on her feet that separated her legs. She was still immersed in the dream and kept struggling until a cold feeling suddenly came from her lower body. She shivered all over and abruptly pulled herself out of the dream of being pressed down by a man in the car, but for a moment she couldn't remember where she was. Her eyelids were unbelievably heavy, and only the most sensitive and slightly painful part of her lower body came from that place, which made her feel much more comfortable. After Feng Ling took the medicine and fell asleep, Li Nanheng applied medicine for her. Previously, when he helped her take a bath, he had noticed that her place was indeed red and swollen. When he helped her bathe, he tried not to hurt her. But now he had to help her apply medicine, so it was inevitable that he had to go deeper. At this moment he saw that there were indeed some tears. Although it was not serious, he could see some faint traces of blood. It was probably because of this that she suddenly had a fever. Li Nanheng carefully helped her apply the ointment with one hand and firmly held her struggling leg with the other. Feeling that she seemed to be trembling because of this way of applying medicine, he looked up at her face and saw that her forehead was densely covered with a layer of sweat. Although her body was tense and her toes curled up because of the medicine, she still couldn't open her eyes. W. For M. Chapter 1301. Sweating meant that the fever had subsided. Li Nanheng slowly put her leg down to avoid hurting her again. He covered her with the quilt again and reached out to touch her forehead. The temperature dropped a little, but it was still slightly higher than usual. Perhaps it was because of the burning pain down there, but now because of the cool mint of the ointment, it felt more comfortable. However, it was still a little uncomfortable. Feng Ling furrowed her brows in her sleep and rubbed her legs uncomfortably. Li Nanhing pressed her down, bent down to whisper against her lips, "Don't move. The medicine I just applied has an anti-inflammatory effect. It'll be fine tomorrow, okay?" As expected, Feng Ling didn't move anymore. She tilted her head and continued to sleep. Li Nanhing went to get a towel to help her wipe the sweat on her body. The afternoon passed and evening came. When it was dark, Feng Ling opened her eyes after a nap and saw the Nordic-style ceiling light in the hotel room. She was stunned for a long time before she seemed to smell food. She turned around and saw a hotel dining car placed by the bed. She moved a little and found that she was not wearing anything under the quilt. However, her body had been wiped clean after sweating, and it was very clean. Feng Ling glanced at the food on the dining car. She didn't need to guess to know what was going on. These were all the food she had ordered at the airport in the base cafeteria. It was Li Nanheng. Feng Ling closed her eyes and was about to sit up. At this moment, the door of the suite on the other side of the room opened, and the man's tall and straight figure came over. The moment she saw Li Nanheng's face, she recalled the scene she had experienced in the car, and her eyes instantly turned cold. "You're awake. Eat something." Li Nanheng didn't ask if she was still uncomfortable or in pain. As long as she didn't want to answer, it was useless to ask anything. It was better to let her eat to preserve her strength. As expected, Feng Ling didn't speak but just looked at him coldly. Li Nanheng came over and picked up a bowl of noodles on the dining car. He picked up some side dishes and put them on the plate. He sat by the bed and helped her up to eat. When he stretched out his hand, Feng Ling's expression shrank and she watched him warily. "Li Nanheng, eat first. I know you're angry, but don't make things difficult for your body. You can't return to the Feng family in your current state. Even if you want to kill me, scold me, or hit me, you have to have the strength to do it." Feng Ling said hoarsely, "Since you know that I want to beat you, scold you, and kill you, you still want to do such a thing?" Li Nanheng fed the noodles to her mouth and said calmly, "My self-control has never been effective in front of you. I used to endure it again and again. Today I just didn't restrain myself. Don't you know how much of your words are deliberately provoking and angering me?" Feng Ling looked at him in disbelief. "Li Nanheng, do you mean you're in the right even though you raped me?" The man sent the noodles to her mouth and said softly, "Open your mouth." After speaking, Feng Ling closed her mouth and looked at him with pursed lips. She didn't open her mouth, so he wasn't in a hurry. He just looked at her patiently. "Not hungry? And stamina? Can you do it again?" Hearing that she could do it again, Feng Ling clenched her fists under the blanket and stared at him coldly for a long time. It wasn't until Li Nanheng broke the noodles that he unhappily picked up some more noodles and brought them to her mouth that she slowly opened her mouth and reluctantly ate the noodles. She chewed very slowly. Although the food in this hotel was not bad, the feeling of being fed by Li Nanheng bite by bite and the pain in her lower body even after being drugged reminded her how much of a beast this man was in the car on the mountain today. Right, apply the medicine. Although she felt swollen and painful, it was not the kind of burning pain. The things she felt in her sleep. She suddenly turned to look at the ointment by the side and saw that half of it had been used. He had helped her apply the ointment. He applied the medicine there. Feng Ling's face instantly turned red and she looked at him in disbelief. Li Nanheng seemed to know what she was thinking and didn't say anything, lest she would be more embarrassed. He continued to feed her until Feng Ling took a few more bites mechanically and picked up a few other dishes she liked to eat and brought them to her mouth. Perhaps it was because these were all her favorite foods in the past, but she hadn't eaten them much in the past year in England. After eating for a while, she finally had an appetite and Feng Ling no longer resisted. She didn't turn her head away until she was full and refused to eat any more. Seeing that she was almost full, Li Nanheng let her go and took a tissue to wipe her mouth. If it weren't for the scene that happened on the mountain, Feng Ling would have thought that this man had changed from a domineering demon to a gentle and warm man just by looking at his patient and gentle side. Unfortunately, it was a pity that even if this man knelt down, he wouldn't be able to erase his beastly behavior today. After eating, get out of bed and see if you feel uncomfortable walking. Apply some medicine before going to bed at night. After using up this small tube of medicine, you should feel much better tomorrow morning. Li Nanheng pushed the dining cart aside and looked at Feng Ling. "Give me the medicine. I'll apply it myself." Feng Ling frowned. Li Nanheng's cold brows moved. "How are you going to do it yourself? Can you find it yourself? Can you see it?" Feng Ling, it's not the first time. We were together many times when we were good. It's not like I didn't help you bathe in the jungle. I've seen everything that shouldn't be seen. Li Nanhing picked up the tube of medicine again and looked at it. At the same time he said, "This medicine needs to be applied carefully and evenly. Are you sure you want to do it yourself?" Feng Ling expressionlessly snatched the tube of medicine from his hand and lowered her head to look at the dense English words on it. She was sure that he was right. She did need to apply it evenly and apply it to all the wounds inside. If it was her, she would not be able to do it herself. At the thought of how the man didn't take her to the hospital but went to the pharmacy to buy this medicine, she felt embarrassed. She simply threw the medicine back into his hand and didn't say anything. She leaned back on the bed and said, "Give me your phone." Li Nanhing stood up, took her phone and handed it to her. Feng Ling took it and did not even look at him. Right now she really couldn't go back to the Feng family. Her grandparents missed her every day. If she went back in such a sickly state, the two elders would probably be anxious again. She could only go back tomorrow when she was in a better state. She picked up her phone and saw that there were several missed calls. One was from Mr. Zand, 2 were from Jin Wan, and 2 were from Mr. Ian. There were also some unread text messages, mixed with Xiao Ba's text messages. W. For M. Chapter 1302. Feng Ling leaned against the bed and replied to the messages one by one. Li Nanheng called the hotel staff to come in and pushed the dining cart away. After a while, someone came and the room returned to silence. Feng Ling had been lying on the bed, tightly covered with the blanket. Li Nanheng poured a glass of warm water and sat down by the bed. He placed the glass on the bedside table beside her. "Your body temperature is still around 37.5 degrees. It's still a low fever. Drink more water." Feng Ling did not respond, nor did she look up at him. She just remained silent. Li Nanheng sighed inwardly. The problem between him and Feng Ling was not particularly big. Back then she was indeed very angry, but after all, it was not a matter of principle between the two of them. She was just angry that he did not even ask her before helping her make a decision for the future and removing her from the base. However, it was clear that he had raped her in the car. He had really committed a big crime. Because Feng Ling had been under the blanket and her fever had not completely subsided, she would occasionally sweat. Li Nanheng sat silently by the side and watched her. She ignored him and did not say anything, so he did not speak. Until he caught a glimpse of her sweating again, her long hair poking at her neck and shoulders because she was sitting on the edge of the bed. Although the hair around her neck looked particularly charming to men, it looked more like she should not be too comfortable. In the past, Feng Ling had short hair. When she was in the jungle, her hair was just over her chin. Now that her hair was considered long, Li Nanheng had never seen it on her. She kept looking at her phone. He watched her for a while and saw that she occasionally raised her hand to push the hair on her neck back. After doing this 2 or 3 times, Li Nanheng got up and left. Feng Ling didn't care where he went. After resting here for a night, she would return to the Feng family tomorrow and have nothing to do with him. After about 10 minutes, Li Nanheng returned. Feng Ling did not even look at him until the man walked back to the bed and said, "Sit up." Feng Ling looked up at him. "What are you doing?" However, he still subconsciously sat up from the bed. At this moment, the man walked around the side of the bed, leaned over, and lifted her hair that was always poking at her neck because of her sweat. Then she felt the man's somewhat clumsy movements as he helped her comb her hair. Feng Ling seemed to hear the sound of a rubber band being tossed back and forth in the man's hand. However, after fiddling with it for a long time, he still failed to help her tie her hair up. "Feng Ling, Li Nanheng, what are you doing?" She couldn't help asking coldly. After being tortured by her hair for a few minutes, the man still couldn't tie his hair into a proper ponytail. His cold brows furrowed as if he had encountered an epic problem. He said, "I saw that your hair was poking at your neck, so I wanted to help you comb your hair. How do you use this thing?" Feng Ling. Jin Wan had once used Li Nanheng to describe a straight man. Now she finally understood. Li Nanheng, who usually dealt with the internal and external injuries of various members of the base and could even wrap bandages like a doctor, was defeated by a rubber band that only women would use. So he went out just now to help her find something to comb her hair? Feng Ling raised her hand and took the rubber band from his hand. She said expressionlessly, "Let go of my hair. I'll do it myself." Hearing this, Li Nanheng seemed to be liberated and quickly let go. Then he saw Feng Ling skillfully comb the soft hair behind her head. The rubber band that was as difficult as ascending to heaven in his hands was casually done in her hands. After her hair was done, her neck was clean and comfortable. Feng Ling picked up her phone again and turned back to look at the man standing by the bed. He knew that he had done something wrong. Step by step to atone for his sins? What was the use? Feng Ling still ignored him, but when she sat back on the bed, she raised her head and tucked her hair behind her ear. Suddenly, she felt that when her hair was particularly short, she had never had this kind of trouble because of long hair. This was the first time she had combed her hair like this in front of Li Nanheng. She glanced at him again and asked, "Where did you get the rubber band?" "When I went downstairs, I met a 4-year-old girl who happened to be holding a bag of newly bought rubber bands. I bought a mini doll from the shopping cabinet in the hotel lobby for her and asked her to give me a rubber band," Li Nanheng said and sat back on the bed. A rubber band didn't even cost 50 cents. Generally, the things in the shopping cabinets in the hotel lobby were very expensive, and the original mini doll cost at least hundreds of yuan. Feng Ling was speechless about the rubber band on her head that was worth hundreds of yuan. "Mr. Li's equivalent exchange is really unusual," Feng Ling said mildly and sarcastically. Feng Ling's tone was indifferent and she said mockingly, "But at least you know to exchange something with that little girl instead of shooting her. It seems that you're not as thorough as a beast." Li Nanheng's expression darkened. From today onwards, this woman had really equated him with a psychopath who would forcibly seize things from others. He was not annoyed. He picked up the tube of ointment. "I see that you've been looking at your phone idly. I think you're going to sleep soon. Why don't you apply the ointment again?" As soon as she heard that he wanted to apply the ointment, Feng Ling's slightly cold and mocking manner instantly disappeared, and she looked at him with a tense expression. Li Nanheng played with the tube of ointment and looked straight into her eyes with a faint smile. "At least I know to take care of you before separating your legs instead of directly breaking them open. It seems that I'm indeed not as thorough as a beast." Feng Ling's fingers tightened and she looked at him coldly. "Li Nanheng, you brought me back from England and tortured me like this. Are you very proud of yourself?" The man looked into her eyes. "You've been expelled from 11 base and I've also expelled myself. From the age of 13 to the age of 23 you, Feng Ling, have been rooted here for 10 years. In the end, you said that you can attend a dinner party with another man and casually have a candlelight dinner with roses. You're very proud to see me being provoked, aren't you?" As he spoke, Li Nanheng leaned forward on the chair and looked into her eyes at close range. "I've loved you for 10 years. Did I agree to break up with you just because you said so?" Li Ha. Daddy T understand. I'm already working hard to atone for my sins. Yesterday I really couldn't hold it in. Please forgive me, Daddy. It's the beginning of the month. Please throw the monthly ticket at me. Please, please, please. W. For M. Chapter 1303. I've loved you for 10 years. Did I agree to break up with you just because you said so? Li Nanheng was not a person who was obsessed with a certain topic. After speaking, he got up to answer the phone and did not mention it again after returning. On the contrary, when Feng Ling slept at night, the moment she closed her eyes, these words echoed in her ears. In the middle of the night, the room was very quiet. This bed was very big, but Li Nanheng did not want to provoke her anymore, so he simply let her sleep alone. He sat on the sofa by the window and fell asleep at some point. Feng Ling had a dream. She dreamed of the 10 years after she met Li Nanheng in the orphanage. After waking up, she could not fall asleep. She sat up on the bed and looked at the man who had fallen asleep on the sofa. After watching for a while, she lowered her eyes, lifted the blanket and got out of bed. She walked over and stood in front of the man, watching him sitting there sleeping. After watching for a long time, she picked up the thin blanket on the other side of the sofa and gently covered him. After covering him, she leaned over and watched the man with his eyes closed. Li Nanheng, I once spent so many years in 11 base. I thought I would take root there, but in the end that path was still broken. I have no way back. Feng Ling looked at his sleeping face and said quietly and lightly, "You were the one who helped me choose this path. I can't give up halfway. I want to go back and be the towering tree of the Feng family as you wish. I don't know if I can support the Feng family, but I will work hard." After speaking, Feng Ling turned to pick up her clothes and change. She then picked up her phone and his electronic car key and left the hotel. She went to the car to retrieve her luggage, passport and other things. Then she placed the electronic car key at the front desk of the hotel and asked them to return it to Li Nanheng. When Feng Ling left the hotel room, it was 2:30 in the morning. She put on her clothes and went out. When the door opened and closed, the man on the sofa slowly opened his eyes. Feng Ling sat in the taxi. The sky outside was still dark. After all, the sky had not brightened yet. Unknowingly, dawn was approaching. She arrived at the entrance of the Feng family's villa in New York. Not many people knew that she had returned. After all, Li Nanheng had suddenly brought her back. The Feng family members were even more clueless. She didn't want to disturb everyone's rest, so she got out of the car alone with her suitcase. When she walked into the Feng family's door, Auntie Mai, who had woken up early to prepare breakfast with the servants, saw her. She immediately thought that she had seen wrongly and called out in disbelief, "Second miss?" At the same time, a person walked down the stairs from the second floor. Qin Shuk had been studying abroad for the past 2 years and had just returned to America. She had yet to recover from the jet lag and had woken up very early. As she went downstairs, she yawned and rubbed her eyes. All of a sudden, she heard Auntie Mai scream and her hand trembled. She abruptly put down her hand and met Feng Ling's gaze. Looking at Feng Ling, who had long hair and was dressed in women's clothes, Qin Shuk staggered and almost fell down the stairs. Her eyes widened. "Ah, you." When she heard that Feng Ling was a woman and the second daughter of the Feng family, she didn't believe it. However, there had been too many complicated things happening in the Feng family in the past 2 years, so she couldn't comment too much. She just stayed here for a few days after returning to China. After all, when she was young, she often hung out with Qin Xiu's mother and the 2 elders of the Feng family. Even though her surname was Qin, she was only a cousin, but she had always been very familiar with the Feng family. She was even more familiar with them than her own family. Now that she suddenly saw a living Feng Ling in women's clothes, Qin Shuk was so shocked that she couldn't close her mouth for a long time. She stared blankly at her, looking at her from head to toe, and then from toe to head several times. Feng Ling shifted her gaze away from Qin Shuk and nodded at Auntie Mai. "I rushed back overnight and didn't inform anyone. We'll talk about it after Grandpa and Grandma wake up. You can do whatever you need to do. Don't worry about me." "Aya. Give me your luggage first. You must be tired after coming back so late. Hurry back to your room to rest or sit for a while. When the 2 elders wake up, let's eat breakfast. Second miss, this is your first breakfast. The preparations we've prepared are too simple. Wait until noon or evening." Auntie Mai returned to her senses and quickly stepped forward to take the suitcase from Feng Ling's hand. The old master and the old madam are old and usually wake up very early. They should be awake soon. Give me your luggage first. We've prepared too simple. Wait for noon or evening. No need, Auntie Mai. I'm not picky. Feng Ling smiled at her. She knew that the people of the Feng family were truly good to her. When she first returned to the Feng family, she was still a little distant. However, as time passed, because she could feel that they were sincere to her, she gradually integrated into this family and got along well with Auntie Mai. Auntie Mai was a little excited. She raised her hand to wipe the tears from the corner of her eyes. "Second miss, it's not easy for you. You left home for 20 years at such a young age. As soon as you returned home, you had to shoulder such a heavy burden. Before you could enjoy the warmth of your family, you were sent to England to study. Now that you're finally back, can you finally have a good rest? Young people have limitless prospects. Don't work too hard." Feng Ling nodded. "Thank you, Auntie Mai. I'll rest at home for a few days. Don't worry." Okay. I'll go prepare breakfast." Auntie Mai chuckled and quickly turned to go to the kitchen. She turned to see that the Qin family's young lady was still in a daze on the stairs. She could tell that her eyes were only filled with surprise. She smiled and went to do her own things. At this moment, Feng Ling turned to look at Qin Shuk. Qin Shuk widened her eyes for a long time. Seeing that she finally had a chance to interrupt, she quickly raised her hand and stared at him in surprise. You. Feng Ling tilted her head slightly and glanced at her with a faint smile. "Miss Qin, long time no see." Seeing that Feng Ling was actually smiling, Qin Shuk instantly raised her hand to cover her chest. "Oh my God, you actually know how to smile." Feng Ling. Why couldn't she smile? "But you're really a woman," Qin Shuk exclaimed as she walked down quickly. She walked up to Feng Ling and circled around her several times. She sized her up. TSK, you're really a woman. And you know how to smile. You're so beautiful. If you were still the little brother I liked, I would have fainted on the spot if you smiled at me like that. But you're actually a woman." Chapter 1304. Feng Ling curved her lips and looked at her from the corner of her eye. "So what if I'm a woman? Can't you faint when a woman smiles at you? Hey, stop. Qin Shuk raised her hand and gestured for her to stop. Little Feng Ling? Oh no, it's not little brother Feng Ling. It's cousin Feng Ling. Yes, cousin. You and Feng Mingzhu are both my cousins. But you shouldn't be much older than me, right? As she spoke, she looked at Feng Ling up and down for a while. Perhaps you're my cousin. You're still young. Be careful. Now that you're a woman, don't speak with such a seductive expression. Do you know that you're my first love? Do you know that my heart is bleeding when you stand in front of me dressed like this and with such long hair? My youth, my budding feelings actually fell into the hands of a woman disguised as a man. I can't accept it. Although Qin Shuk strongly expressed her unwillingness, she only kept walking back and forth in front of Feng Ling. From time to time, she would clench her fists angrily to express her unhappiness. However, this caused Feng Ling to be unable to hold back the polite smile on her face. After thinking for a moment, she picked up her phone and handed it to her. Seeing her actions, Qin Shuk instantly raised her eyebrows. What are you doing? Didn't you dream of getting my phone number back then? Feng Ling tilted her head. Take it. Remember it yourself. Qin Shuk. Although she looked very unwilling, Qin Shuk turned her head away with an arrogant expression. Who wants your phone number, especially since you're still a woman? Let me tell you, my sexual orientation is very normal. I'm only interested in little brothers. With that, she suddenly reached out and took Feng Ling's phone. She quickly and decisively pressed a number. When her own phone rang, Qin Shuk saved her number in Feng Ling's phone. The name saved in the address book was, The Invincible Beautiful Little Cutie Qin Shuk. Feng Ling. After that, Feng Ling returned to her room. Qin Shuk was still unwilling to give up and kept asking her when she was born. She had been wondering whether Feng Ling was her cousin or her cousin. When the old man and the old lady woke up and saw that Feng Ling had returned, they were extremely excited and rushed to Feng Ling's room to talk to her. Qin Shuk could not interrupt and could only sit by the side and stare at Feng Ling from time to time, occasionally adding a sentence. When it was time for breakfast, Qin Shuk took the opportunity to ask about Feng Ling's real birthday. In the end, when she learned that Feng Ling was half a year older than her, she immediately held her chin with one hand and sighed. Oh, so you still have to call me cousin. Back then, Feng Ling didn't particularly dislike Qin Shuk, this enthusiastic little girl. This kind of straightforward person made people feel relaxed. She rarely interacted with others, but Feng Ling treated Qin Shuk better and could chat with her at the dining table. I didn't expect the cold little brother in the past to be so approachable now. Qin Shuk sighed. It's a pity that she's a woman. Shuk, what are you saying? Old Madame Feng didn't know that Qin Shuk had liked Feng Ling. She thought she was stirring up trouble and quickly glared at her. Qin Shuk immediately stuck out her tongue at Feng Ling. Feng Ling also curved her lips lightly. Grandma, it's okay. Cousin Shuk is joking with me. Seeing that Feng Ling didn't mind, old Madame Feng was relieved. After all, Shuk often hung out with Mingzhu. Although Qin Shuk was straightforward and didn't have many thoughts, she was afraid that she would be dissatisfied with Feng Ling because of Feng Mingzhu. But now it seemed that she was overthinking. Qin Shuk actually liked Feng Ling. Since their relationship could be very harmonious, she might as well strike while the iron was hot. Shuk, haven't you finished all your advanced courses outside? Old Madame Feng asked as she picked up some food for Qin Shuk. Shouldn't you settle down in America? I don't think you like to return to Los Angeles. Why don't you find something to do in New York? Qin Shuk raised her brows. Sure. I don't want to go back to Los Angeles anyway. My parents are too naggy. They've been nagging me since I was young. I still want to be outside by myself. Grandmother Feng nodded and turned to look at Feng Ling, who was eating quietly. Shuk, who also majored in business. If you take over the Feng family's companies, she can help you. You two little sisters can help each other. This way it's better than going alone. Grandmother Feng nodded and turned to look at Feng Ling, who was eating quietly. Oh, Qin Shuk raised her brows. Grandaunt, so you want me to accompany cousin Feng Ling to help you manage the Feng family's companies? Old Madame Feng immediately smiled and glanced at her. What? You don't want to? Qin Shuk blinked and turned to look at Feng Ling. I'm fine with anything. It just depends on whether cousin is willing to let me stay by her side to help. Feng Ling put down the cutlery in her hand and looked at Qin Shuk seriously for a while. Then she asked, I'm definitely willing. But before I let you stay, I have to confirm one thing. What is it? Cousin, tell me. There's nothing wrong with your sexual orientation, right? Qin Shuk, Grandfather Feng and Grandmother Feng. Qin Shuk rolled her eyes at the plate in front of her. Don't worry, I like men. and then let's go together. Feng Ling looked calm. Qin Shuk rolled her eyes at him again and gritted her teeth. How infuriating. Why did she give Feng Ling the impression that she was a lesbian? She definitely only liked men, okay? Back then she liked the little brother version of Feng Ling. Now that she had such a powerful cousin, not to mention that she didn't have this sexual interest, even if her brain was flooded and she really liked women, she probably wouldn't be able to handle someone like Feng Ling. Old Madame Feng smiled and turned to Grandfather Feng. Young people nowadays talk about things we don't understand, haha. Grandfather Feng also looked at Feng Ling with a smile. It's good that Shuk is helping you. We can be more at ease. Don't quarrel with each other. If there's anything unpleasant, just tell us. We watched Shuk grow up and know her temper. She doesn't have any complicated thoughts. She's just a little impatient. Feng Ling, please be more tolerant of her. If you can't take it anymore, tell us. It's good enough that cousin doesn't bully me. You actually said that I have a bad temper? Qin Shuk was unhappy. She turned to look at Feng Ling. With her skills, I can't even beat 10 of her. What else can I do to her? No matter what, I'm the one who's at a disadvantage, okay? Chapter 1305. Feng Ling smiled. I won't hit you. Look. Her words are clearly a threat. She's reminding me that she really knows how to hit people. Qin Shuk really couldn't eat anymore. She came from 11 base. Great aunt, I'm the one who you have to stand up for. It's me. It's not her. All right. Matriarch Feng couldn't stop laughing. I think the two of you will get along very well in the future. I don't care anymore. Go deal with the relationship between you two sisters. Let's eat. Qin Shuk picked up the cutlery again and glared at Feng Ling across the table. Feng Ling only smiled and ignored her occasional childish temper. Feng Ling rested for a day at the Feng family's residence and went to the companies under the Feng Corporation's name in New York the next day. As the Feng family's business had failed in recent years, there were many small companies that needed to be integrated. In the past, it was the Feng Corporation, but now it was just a bunch of small companies. Some made money and some did not. The two elders were old and did not have the energy to manage too much. They could only maintain the profits on the surface, but they could not continue to do more. Feng Ling and Qin Shuk sat in the car and looked at the information about all the companies under the Feng family's name. The driver sent by the Feng family drove quietly in front. Although Qin Shuk usually looked like a carefree child, when it came to doing things she was very serious. Especially when she sat in the car with Feng Ling to discuss the various plans the Feng family was facing, she had many unique opinions with Feng Ling. Then let's do it this way. When they arrived at the company's headquarters in New York, the car was parked outside. Feng Ling put the information aside in the car. I'm still a beginner in these areas. I'm not like you who have studied business and finance for many years. Furthermore, you've studied abroad and have practical experience. The two of us will follow the plan step by step. First, we'll transfer the company's management, and then we'll start step by step. All right, didn't you study in London for a long time? What I've learned in the past 5 years can't even compare to what you've learned in the outside world for a year. Let's support each other a little. There's absolutely no problem. Qin Shuk blinked at her. One is quiet, one is active. Even when we go out to discuss clients, we can complement each other. Don't worry, I'll definitely stand on the same side as you and help you take back all the power of the Feng Corporation. Feng Ling smiled. Then how should I thank you? I remember that apart from Li Nanheng, there was a little brother who often appeared with you, right? Qin Shuk whispered into Feng Ling's ear. That little brother is also quite handsome, but compared to you in men's clothes, he's still inferior. But in the end, you're a woman. You're beautiful to the bone and not the skin. It's only natural that you're inferior to him. Thinking about it, that little brother's looks are not bad and his personality is also good. Introduce him to me later. Feng Ling, she tried her best to recall and felt that the person Qin Shuk was talking about was K. Feng Ling smiled. All right, you have good taste. I'll find a chance to introduce you. Deal. Let's go. I'll accompany you to the Feng Corporation to kill the enemy. 10 months. From the time Feng Ling returned to America to taking over all the businesses under the Feng family, she spent 3 months to take back the power of the company and reorganize the company into a corporation. She spent another 2 months to change the company from inside to outside, replacing it with a group of people who were capable and obedient. She also asked for the resignation of all the old people who were domineering in the company. She spent a total of 10 months to finally gain a foothold in the Feng Corporation. The companies under the Feng Corporation had also returned to the right track a few months ago. In the company, Feng Ling was looking at a financial data. She recalled some of Jin Wan's habits of checking the financial accounts and imitated her. She didn't expect it to be useful. This way of checking the accounts was very effective. All the loopholes could be seen at a glance. Qin Shuk came in with a tablet and read the media's awards for the Feng Corporation's outstanding performance this year. No one dares to believe that a person who has never come into contact with business can stand firm in the business world with such a terrifying momentum. There are all kinds of rumors about this woman named Feng Ling. It's said that she was once the daughter of the Feng family who was lost outside. Later, what's the point of reading these gossip news every day? Feng Ling continued to look at her financial report without looking up. These media outlets have made up all kinds of stories about you. I'm reading the different versions of you written by these people every day. Qin Shuk walked over with a smile and put down the tablet. By the way, when you were answering the internal call in the office, another call came in. It seems to be from the Dr. Qin you mentioned before. Speaking of this Dr. Qin, I've heard you mention him a few times. His surname is also Qin. Hey, should you introduce him to me one day? It's not easy to meet someone with the same surname in America. Hearing that it was Dr. Qin, Feng Ling raised her head and glanced at her. Dr. Qin, don't even think about it. It's impossible for him to be with you. Tisk, I've been thinking about seducing little brother K. How could I seduce Dr. Qin? I like all kinds of little brothers, but I also have my principles, okay? Qin Shuk rolled her eyes at her and looked at the time. Dr. Qin called about 10 minutes ago. Do you want to call him back? And I'll call back later. Feng Ling lowered her head to look at the report again. Qin Shuk had pulled her long hair to do a new style not long ago. It was slightly curled and scattered behind her back. When she went to get her hair done, it was because she wanted to meet a long-term client. Qin Shuk said that she looked like a little girl all day long and looked easy to bully, so she took her to have her hair permed. Feng Ling gradually got used to it. Occasionally, when she looked at herself in the mirror, which was completely different from the short-haired tomboy in the past, she would be absent-minded and wonder if the woman in the mirror was still herself. When Qin Shuk went out to prepare for the executive meeting, Feng Ling put down the report in her hand, picked up her phone and called Dr. Qin. Hello Dr. Qin, what's the matter? Hearing the man's words, Feng Ling's hand, which had just put down the report, stiffened. Jinwan? How did she get shot? Is it serious? Where? Los Angeles? Chapter 1306. Feng Ling had planned to return to England to stay with Mr. Zan for a few days, but Jin Wan's sudden accident disrupted her original plan. If it was just a minor injury it would be fine, but Dr. Qin had specially flown to America from High City and would transfer to Los Angeles in New York. If it wasn't a big deal, Dr. Qin wouldn't have told her to be mentally prepared. Because Jin Wan had been shot by a gunshot, and it was about 3 inches below her neck. That kind of place was almost fatal. She stood up in fear. She didn't even have time to change her clothes or pack her things and walked out. Hey, where are you going? Qin Shuk was still outside and hadn't walked far. Hearing the sound of the door opening, she turned to see Feng Ling walking out quickly. Feng Ling had never been used to wearing high heels, but on some occasions she had to wear them to match her clothes. She was wearing high heels today. Usually as long as she wore high heels she wouldn't walk very fast, but today she walked like the wind. A friend is seriously injured. I have to go to Los Angeles now. I'll go with Dr. Qin later. Help me take care of the company for a few days. Feng Ling left in a hurry without looking back. Hearing the seriousness in her tone, Qin Shuk quickly followed. Oh, seriously injured in Los Angeles? Is it Li Nanham? Feng Ling's voice was heavy. Jin Wan. Qin Shuk paused in her steps. Jin Wan. No wonder Feng Ling was so anxious. This was not the first time Feng Ling had heard of this Mrs. Mo. She was truly one of the few good friends she had in her life. Knowing that Qin Shuk was very reliable, Feng Ling was very relieved about New York. She went to the underground parking lot, changed into flat shoes in the car, and drove all the way to the airport. When she arrived at the airport, Qin Siding had just gotten off the plane and was preparing to go to Los Angeles. The two of them met and didn't have time to exchange pleasantries. They chose the nearest flight together. In the waiting hall, Feng Ling was still answering a call from the company. Qin Siding went to buy 2 cups of coffee. Seeing that Feng Ling was busy, he didn't say much. He glanced at the time and saw that there was still half an hour before boarding time. He placed the coffee in his hand on the seat next to her. Feng Ling put down the phone and turned to look at the coffee by the side. She then glanced at Qin Siding. Sorry, Dr. Qin. I have something to do at the company. I've only taken over for a few months. I still have a lot to deal with. It doesn't matter. You must be much busier than before. Qin Siding smiled understandingly. Back then you were still a little Feng Ling who only listened to orders in 11 base. Now that you've grown up, you're CEO Feng. Feng Ling sighed with a smile. What do you mean by, always? To let a person who knows nothing about these things forcibly cut off everything in the past, swallow it whole, and relearn these things that he has never come into contact with before, to me, it's just a heavy burden that I have no choice but to carry on my shoulders. Qin Siding held the coffee in his hand and was not in a hurry to drink it. He just looked at her. So, it was Li Nanheng who cut off the past for you. That's why you've been ignoring him like this? Not just that. That bastard had kidnapped her from England 10 months ago and had tortured her in the car for a few hours. It was so painful that she was still scared when she thought about it. I didn't leave anyone hanging. Feng Ling also picked up the coffee, opened the lid on the cup and gently blew on it. Her movements were quiet and natural, and then she curved her lips, but the smile did not reach her eyes. But after all, he was the one who helped me choose this path. Returning to the Feng family and returning to New York are all according to the path I have to take now. If I give up halfway because of him, or if he regrets halfway and comes to disturb my current life, then I'm afraid there's something wrong with his IQ. Of course, she knew what Li Nanheng was thinking. She didn't do anything, nor did she make a fuss in front of him. She just followed the path that he had chosen for her and walked on it. As for Li Nanheng, he just swallowed his blood. He couldn't see or touch it. He could suffocate to death every day. What was there to be angry about? This silent punishment was enough. Feng Ling took a sip of coffee and didn't want to talk about Li Nanheng anymore. She only asked, "What do you think about Jin Wan's injury?" "I've called a friend in the hospital where she is now. She is injured in the head and the central nervous system of her spine." When Qin Siding mentioned Jin Wan, his expression became slightly serious. After all, it was really a matter of life and death. "I'm not optimistic about the current emergency treatment. It's very likely that she won't be able to survive." Hearing this, Feng Ling's brows furrowed imperceptibly, and her grip on the coffee cup tightened. Early in the morning, Qin Siding, who flew from New York to Los Angeles overnight, rushed to the hospital. The lights in the emergency room were on until the next morning. When Qin Siding arrived, Jin Wan had not come out of the emergency room. "How long has she been in there?" Qin Siding walked over and asked. Li Nanheng held a cigarette in his hand, but he didn't smoke it. He just sat here with Mo Jingshan all night. He glanced at Qin Siding and said lightly, "It's been more than 12 hours. 12 hours. She hadn't been declared dead yet. Under normal circumstances, it might be possible to save her. Otherwise she wouldn't have lasted so long." Qin Siding nodded. "When I saved your life with Dr. Wendell in Los Angeles, Dr. Wendell was very skilled in removing bullets from dangerous parts. At that time, I just cooperated with him in the operating room. Now even without me, I believe he has enough ability to save Jin Wan. After all, it's been so long and he hasn't given up yet. Let's wait a little longer." Although Li Nanheng's skills were excellent, he had participated in countless missions in 11 base and suffered many injuries. He had experienced life and death more than once or twice. Even he couldn't remember how many times this Dr. Wendell in Los Angeles had helped him remove bullets. "Am I the one in a hurry now?" Li Nanheng pointed with his chin in the direction of the stone, on the bench outside the emergency room. Mo Jingshan was stained with Jin Wan's blood, which had dried up, but he hadn't been pushed out yet. Just overnight, Mo Jingshan's chin had some stubble, and his body was covered with blood. He was so miserable that even Qin Siding couldn't recognize him. When the doctor finally came out and announced the success of the operation, but Mo Jingshan was still in a very critical period and had to be sent directly to the ICU and couldn't be visited for the time being, everyone outside, although they didn't say much, was obviously relieved. At least the operation was successful. It was much better to survive the critical period than to be declared dead on the spot. In this way, at least Jin Wan could survive a few more days with her own vitality. W. For M. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.